Understanding the behaviors of murderers and serial killers has long been a concern for humanity, and thanks to the entertainment industry, it is even experiencing a renaissance. I wondered what it would be like if this time we investigated someone from the top shelf of the worst. Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin is one of the most evil mass murderers in history, but he is also one of the most influential figures, about whom most people know very little. I'm not saying this because I made this documentary, but his life is one of, if not the most interesting, or even the most shocking one can ever encounter. How someone became a trainee priest, a meteorologist, a bank robber, a gangster, a terrorist, a Bolshevik revolutionary, an anti-state rebel, a convicted and exiled criminal, a murderer, a mass-murdering dictator, and Adolf Hitler's biggest enemy, who was involved with almost every woman who crossed his path, is definitely worth telling. His ruthlessness and constant domestic terror paved the way for his effectiveness, whether it was through genocides, the Gulag system, or the systematic elimination of his military and political circles. To understand how he became a tyrant, we must delve deep into his life, as all the evidence points to the same conclusion. He struggled to show any kind of emotion for others. Perhaps the only two people Joseph Stalin really loved were his mother, Yekaterina, and his first wife, also Yekaterina. I know history isn't for everyone because of the dates. It all happened long ago, they already died, and who cares? But I still ask you to take the time, because with Joseph Stalin, it is especially true that to understand his death, you have to know his life. The dreaded Georgian dictator of the Soviet Union was born on December 18, 1878, as Yosef Vissarionovich Djugashvili, or Yosef Djugashvili, in Gori, an industrial city in the heart of the Caucasus country, which was then under the rule of the Russian Empire. He was baptized on December 29th, while his deeply religious mother, Ekaterina Gulags, feared for her son more than anything because her other two children, Mikhail and Georgy, unfortunately died in infancy. She was nicknamed Kiki and tried to be strict with the boy, with less than more success. Even as a child, little Joseph was considered difficult to handle. Of course, the lack of a decent father figure played a major role in his troublemaker nature because his father, Bessarion, also known as Beso, was a bankrupt shoemaker who at the peak employed 10 people but blamed his failure on others, as is the case in many families today. Following the loss of their second child and the collapse of his shoe shop, the once devout churchgoer spiraled into alcoholism. His failure was mainly caused because he refused to produce the increasingly popular and fashionable Western European shoes and insisted on making traditional Georgian footwear, which did not prove to be a good business strategy and ultimately backfired. After the bankruptcy, they became impoverished, and the drunk father regularly beat his wife and his only son. In 1883, Kiki realized that her husband was unable to support his family and bravely decided to flee the violence. Ekaterina, or Ketevin in some languages, lost her parents at a young age and married Bessarion when she was 16. She was considered a strong-willed woman who dared to go against her husband's will. They moved out of their home, and in the following years, they lived in 9 different apartments, but could only rent a room in each. The young boy, who was nicknamed Soso by his parents, nearly died from pneumonia in 1884, but managed to survive after a protracted battle with the infectious disease. In 1886, they moved in with a family friend, Father Christopher Charkviani, where they also rented a room. Kiki started working as a launderer and house cleaner for local families to provide for her son's education. It's worth mentioning that the priest was Bessarion's drinking buddy. At the age of 7, Soso again fell desperately ill with smallpox, which was raging in Gori at the time and left him with scars on his face for the rest of his life. During these years, the teenage sons of Charkviani began to teach Russian to the child, who had previously only spoken Georgian. But this place was important for another reason too, because he met the first love of his life, Father Charkviani's little daughter here. The girl was younger than him. They played dolls together and remained close during their childhood, but it is unknown if she returned his love. Meanwhile, the father wanted his heir to follow in his footsteps as a shoemaker, but the mother had a different vision for their son's future, hoping that Joseph would pursue a career in the church and become a priest. There were obviously religious reasons behind this decision, but becoming a priest also provided a stable source of income. Eventually, the boy went to the Orthodox Gori church school at the age of 10 in 1888, a place originally only the children of church members were allowed to attend, but Father Charkviani managed to enroll him by claiming Soso was the son of a deacon. Despite the mother's financial struggles, she prioritized her son's appearance by using his hard-earned money to buy him proper clothes to protect him from potential bullying. At the age of 12, Josip suffered a severe injury to his left arm from a carriage accident in 1890, leading to months of hospitalization in Tiflis, modern-day Tbilisi. The incident was quite serious. Ekaterina was worried he wouldn't become a priest if he couldn't hold a chalice, to which the boy allegedly said, "Never mind, Mummy. Before I'm a priest, my arm will heal so that I'll be able to hold up the whole church." Soso was an active student at school. His teachers found him talented in drama classes, and he was also a member of the choir, with whom he not only sang at school and church, but also performed at local weddings. However, he wasn't a well-behaved child. A childhood friend of Stalin later recalled that in contrast with the choir membership, he was the best but also the naughtiest pupil in the class. He even organized a gang with some of his friends, and they frequently got into fights with other local children. But these fights probably just resembled Ferenc Molnar's classic youth novel, The Paul Street Boys. Additionally, young Joseph once lit explosive cartridges in a store and tied a frying pan to the tail of a woman's favorite cat. Shortly after his carriage incident, his father kidnapped him and took him to Tiflis to work in a shoe factory, but priests of the school managed to bring the kid back to Gori, after which Bessarion cut off all contact with his family for a while. The child's ideological journey started already in the Orthodox school. During his studies, he encountered one of the most significant philosophical issues, the problem of evil, and he also came into contact with Darwin's works and learned about the concept of evolution. Briefly, the problem of evil discusses the question, if a good and omnipotent God exists, why does he allow the existence of evil and suffering on earth? It's purely speculative, but young Joseph may have given himself the answer, that if an omnipotent God truly exists, he wouldn't allow suffering, and considering the boy grew up in poverty and domestic violence, he may have concluded that the existence of a higher power is unlikely. Because of his harsh circumstances, he became sensitive to social poverty. Around this time, for example, he wanted to become a local administrator and fight against the poverty around Gori. But something was different with these kids. In February 1892, teachers took Joseph and fellow students to witness the public hanging of peasant bandits. Surprisingly, the boys showed sympathy for the condemned. Regarding Stalin, it is also worth highlighting that like Adolf Hitler, he also liked drawing and painting. His teachers even considered him talented, but he did not really practice them himself, instead developed a passion for literature. Soso excelled academically and graduated in 1893, then continued his studies at the Georgian Orthodox Tiflis Theological Seminary. He started the school in August 1894, joining 600 trainee priests who were accommodated in a dormitory with rooms for 20-30 people. He read Goethe and Shakespeare there and could quote Walt Whitman's works, and his school performance was outstanding there too, at least for a while. The seeds of anti-Tsarism were already planted in him there, because as part of the Russian Orthodox Church, the seminary's clergy teachers forbade the students to speak their mother tongue, and only Russian was allowed. This was particularly dramatic, because Tiflis had a population of 160,000 at the time, and only 30% were Russians. The rest were 30% Armenians, 26% Georgians, and a small percentage of Persians, Tatars, and Jews. However, the teenager adored Georgia and expressed his feelings in his poems about patriotism, nature, and land. These poems were published in a newspaper called Iveria under the pseudonym Sosello and actually received a positive reception. Parallel to the ethnic-based oppression, he slowly lost motivation for his studies and became more and more of a rebel. At the time, he was already 17 years old. Based on the school's historical records, he declared himself an atheist, was often late and disorderly in class, and was disrespectful to priests and monks. Furthermore, he joined the Cheap Library, a secret book club, and indulged in reading banned authors' works. An older student named Saeed Devdariani brought him there, where he also had the opportunity to read banned socialist literature for the first time. This left such a deep impression on him that, after delving into the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, he led a Marxist student group in the institution between 1896 and 1898, and completely turned away from God. So if one day someone asks who or what gave the final push for Stalin toward far-left ideologies, the answer is Saeed Devdariani and the Cheap Library. And here I would like to clarify that socialism, communism, and social democracy, while distinct, do share common grounds and somewhat overlap each other, especially at the chaotic beginning of the 20th century. These ideologies all originate from the labor movement and share the common goal of achieving a fairer distribution of wealth and property, albeit through different methods. Despite socialism can and does exist in capitalism, both are originally rejections of capitalism and intend to give economic power to the working class. In a nutshell, socialism aims to reduce differences between social classes with a more proportionate social contribution, while communism wanted to achieve this in a much more radical way by eliminating government, private property, and classes. Yet, Marx used these two terms interchangeably in many cases, and history shows that real communism is difficult to implement in practice. Although, in the interest of fairness, it is important to note that even today's democracies, which differ from state to state, do not necessarily succeed in this. An interesting fact is that many ancient Greeks, including the great Plato and Aristotle, despised this system. The latter considered it a degenerate form of government and the tyranny of the poor. In addition, Aristotle also carried out a small research. He and his students wrote down how many city-states from present-day Libya to Istanbul have real democracies. Well, out of the 158 polices examined, there was only one. The rest were ruled by an oligarchy, which wasn't a degrading term at the time. So overall, except for perhaps Pericles, Hellas, the cradle of democracy, was not really a fan of the system. During these times, Iosif Djugashvili was already known by several names. His mother called him Soso, he used the pen name Sosello, and he started calling himself Koba. Koba is the protagonist of Georgian writer Alexander Kazbegi's book, The Patricide, who fights against Tsarist oppression and seeks revenge for the tragic deaths of his best friend and his friend's love. He also read this book in the banned book club, and according to one of his oldest friends, Yosib Iramashvili, Koba became Soso's god and gave his life meaning. He wished to become Koba. He called himself Koba and insisted we call him that. His face shone with pride and pleasure when we called him Koba. In 1931, Stalin gave an interview with the Swiss-German autobiographer Emil Ludwig, in which he described his first steps in the communist movement. I joined the revolutionary movement at the age of 15, when I became connected with certain illegal groups of Russian Marxists in Transcaucasia. These groups exerted a great influence on me and instilled in me a taste for illegal Marxian literature. But Ludwig went further and asked if he had become a rebel because his parents had treated him badly. Stalin, who was the general secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union by then, said that, "No, my parents were uneducated people, but they did not treat me badly by any means. It was different in the theological seminary of which I was then a student. In protest against the humiliating regime and the Jesuitical methods that prevailed in the seminary, I was ready to become, and eventually did become, a revolutionary, a believer in Marxism as the only genuinely revolutionary doctrine." As I mentioned earlier, Stalin was regularly beaten by his father as a child, so telling it differently in the interview was more about image building. It is also unclear why he spoke of Jesuits while he studied at an Orthodox institution. It is likely that he was referring to church members, the followers of Jesus, when he used the term Jesuit. Throughout his life, Stalin made numerous attempts to conceal or alter the events of his childhood and youth. For example, in 1949, Bloodthirsty Beria, one of his closest henchmen and a key figure in this documentary, wanted to publish Stalin's poems for the dictator's 70th birthday. Among others, Beria tasked Boris Pasternak with the translations, but the project was halted by the boss. Moreover, in the 1920s, he even claimed to be the son of a priest. The interview continued with Ludwig asking whether he could grant the Jesuits any good qualities. Stalin said yes because they were methodical and persevering in their work. However, he added that, but the basis of all their methods is spying, prying, peering into people's souls to subject them to petty torment. What is there good in that? For instance, the spying in the boarding house. At 9 o'clock the bell rings for morning tea. We go to the dining hall, and when we return we find that a search has been made and all our boxes have been turned inside out. What is there good in that? Stalin partially attributed his shift towards communism to his church education and the alleged abuses he experienced there, but the ethnic oppression of the Tsarist regime provided the framework for this. In Georgia, at the beginning of the 20th century, socialism and Marxist ideas gained popularity, and the young man saw the opportunity to break through. Interestingly, it can be stated that Stalin was initially a nationalist, yet he could best express his patriotism in the anti-regime communist movement because he believed that Marxist ideology offered the best solution to financial and social equality. As I mentioned, he was especially sensitive towards poverty, which made him find the basic principles of communism quite appealing. The idea of abolishing social classes and achieving property equality resonated deeply with him. His personal experiences in the seminary and the religion-based Russian nationalism the conservative monarchy represented in the 19th century in conquered Georgia stoked his revolutionary flame. He was so engrossed in the movement that he started learning German to be able to read Marx and Engels' writings in their original language. Koba eventually left the theological school in 1899 and never returned, even though his teachers asked him to continue. However, for propaganda purposes, he later adopted the narrative that his underground activities led to his expulsion. As a member of the movement, he actively participated in strikes, committees, and the distribution of publications. In 1899, thanks to a school friend, he started working as a meteorologist at the Tiflis Observatory, and in January 1900, he was arrested for the first time in his life. The official explanation was that the authorities wanted to collect his father's unpaid taxes from him, but according to historians, it was more likely a cryptic warning to him because of the growing anti-state atmosphere emerging around him. Ultimately, his mother settled the tax debt with the help of wealthier friends and could get her son out of the 12th century Medici fortress prison, also known as the Bastille of Tiflis. But it appears he failed to understand the hint because after his release, he did not stop and began to gather young followers and secretly held socialist ideological training in a Solalaki Street apartment in the southern part of Tiflis. In May 1900, at the age of 22, he gave his first major public speech in front of 500 railway and factory workers, encouraging them to go on strike. Following this, it was inevitable that sooner or later he would catch the attention of the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana. On March 21, 1901, when they apprehended the local Marxists, Djugashvili managed to evade arrest. He was traveling aboard a tram toward the observatory when he noticed Okhrana agents waiting for him around the building, so he decided to get off at a later stop. He never returned, and from then on relied on the donations of friends and sympathizers. Soso continued organizing various political activities and managed to escape another arrest, and in November 1901, he obtained his first political position when he was appointed to the 8-member Tiflis Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The party then dispatched him to the Georgian seaside city of Batumi 224 miles west of the capital. There, he identified an Okrana agent attempting to infiltrate their circle, after which the man was killed. This was the first murder he was involved in. He began working at the local Rothschild oil refinery, but soon became the center of attention there too, after the warehouse caught fire in January 1902 and demanded a bonus for the workers in return for putting out the fire. The company initially rejected the demands, prompting Soso to organize a strike, and they managed to achieve a 30% salary increase. However, in February, the factory fired almost 400 workers, so he called up another strike committee in March. The police eventually arrested its leaders, but Koba once again escaped. Shortly after, he planned a demonstration in front of the prison, but the situation quickly escalated and the crowd stormed the building, which was only stopped by the bloody intervention of the Cossack troops. 13 workers died, and more than 500 were arrested, but the Georgian communist wasn't among them this time either. The secret police only apprehended him on April 5th, once they realized his significant role in the demonstrations. He was taken to the local jail, where his mother visited him twice. Her heart must have been filled with joy when she found her only son in a cell instead of a parish. The 23-year-old man quickly gained respect within the prison walls and continued recruiting others. One of his infamous police photos was taken at that time too, based on which he would probably receive a modeling contract along with the indictment today. He continued his anti-state activities and orchestrated a prison protest, leading to his placement in solitary confinement and his subsequent transfer to the much stricter Kutaisi prison. He persisted in his ideological training and protesting in his new place too, so the authorities decided to change their approach. In July, he was sentenced to 3 years of exile in the small village of Novaya Uda in Irkutsk, eastern Siberia. This was the first such penalty against him, but there will be a few more. He arrived there in November 1903, but interestingly, he didn't really socialize with the other convicted far leftists, but rather drank alcohol with local criminals. Now, though, it is worth putting the period in context. Parallel to his exile, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, founded in 1898, went through a split of historical importance starting in 1903. They were divided into two factions, the Mensheviks, whose name means minority, and the Bolsheviks, which means majority. The latter called themselves the majority simply because they briefly gained control over the party paper called Iskra, or Spark in English, even though they were otherwise the minority in most cases. This de facto separation finally took legal form in 1912, and from then on, the more radical political formation was referred to as the Bolshevik Party, which later became known as the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This split was partly driven by practical reasons. For example, the Mensheviks were less dictatorial. They were willing to accept dissent within the party, they were ready to cooperate with the liberals, and they also had problems with the use of violence. On the other hand, the Bolsheviks were hardline revolutionaries, and even advocated the latter, and instead of a large, loosely organized party, they wanted a smaller but more disciplined and stricter system, with full-time members to make it more difficult for the secret police to infiltrate. Beyond these, there was also a financial reason in the background, perhaps the most important. The Mensheviks envisioned party financing through donations and the collection of membership fees, whereas the Bolsheviks resorted to more unconventional methods, such as bank robberies and attacks on mail trains and carriages for the money, but we will discuss the robberies later. Josip Jugashvili managed to escape from Novaya Uda twice, but the first time he suffered frostbite on his face, which forced him to return. The second time, he didn't stop until Tiflis, and after some interlude, he committed himself to the Bolsheviks, who, ironically, were in the minority in the Caucasus at the time. In the beginning, they wanted to expel him from the Social Democratic Labor Party because he wanted to start a separate Marxist movement, but they were able to convince him not to do it. He also probably realized that this could result in further isolation in the already increasingly fragmented Russian political palette. What is worth knowing about his political views at the time is that he stressed the necessary alliance between the workers and the peasantry, but unlike the more moderate Mensheviks, he wasn't willing to collaborate with the wealthier middle class against the Tsarist autocracy. After the previous strikes, the former trainee priest orchestrated further physical atrocities. One notable incident occurred on New Year's Eve 1904, when he and a group of workers disrupted a party held by a liberal group they deemed bourgeois. Then came 1905, which, due to a series of unforeseen events, became one of the most important years of Joseph Stalin's life. The bloody Russian Revolution erupted. He organized his first militias, and he met Vladimir Ilyich Lenin for the first time. In 1905, a widespread famine struck the Russian Empire, accompanied by soaring unemployment rates and worsening housing conditions. In response, the population expressed their growing social discontent through demonstrations. One of these demonstrations was organized by a controversial Orthodox priest, Father Gapon, on January 22nd in St. Petersburg, the then capital. A large crowd of 50,000 people, mostly workers, marched to the Winter Palace, the residence of the House of Romanov, to present their petition to Tsar Nicholas II. Their initiatives included streamlining bureaucracy, enhancing working conditions, and restraining forced Russification to the detriment of minorities. For instance, non-Russians had limited access to education and could not form trade unions, go on strike, or even vote. So there were numerous issues the demonstrators perceived as oppressive. However, the Imperial Guard troops, tasked with protecting the Tsar and the Winter Palace, received an order to instruct the demonstrators not to cross a specific point. The tense situation quickly escalated, and shots were fired into the angry crowd, followed by an attack by the Cossack cavalry, killing or injuring around 1,000 people, and another 7,000 were arrested. The incident became known as Bloody Sunday. The news rapidly spread across the empire, and demonstrations took place in major cities. By the end of January, 400,000 workers joined the protests even in Congress Poland, which was still under Russian rule in a personal union. Gapon had to hide following the events, placing the blame solely on the Tsar, even though Nicholas II was not present in the Winter Palace or the capital during the march. The priest's role was controversial due to his immense popularity among the workers. Many regarded him as a prophet and a visionary, while he maintained strong ties with the city's top politicians. According to historical records, in 1902, he met Sergei Zubatov, the leader of the special section of the St. Petersburg police, who tasked him with creating a legal workers' organization because the police were extremely unpopular. The intention was to control and wind down the demonstrations through him, and that's why many suspected that Gapon could have been the secret police agent. However, historians remain skeptical, as no official documents support this theory. The revolution endured for nearly 2.5 years, and the losses were huge. On the Tsarist side, 3,600 people were killed or injured, while 15,000 demonstrators died, with another 20,000 wounded and 38,000 captured. But the terrible sacrifices were not in vain, because although the army remained loyal to the emperor, enabling him to maintain his position, he still had to accept a series of reforms. For example, the creation of the Duma, the elected state parliament, and the guarantee of certain fundamental human rights, such as freedom of speech, assembly, and religion, along with universal male suffrage. After the reforms, the revolution calmed down, but discontent and mistrust towards the Tsarist autocracy remained. However, these events presented an excellent opportunity for the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks to gain a large number of new supporters, and the role of Josip Jugashvili must be highlighted here as well. In February 1905, he was in Baku, the present-day capital of Azerbaijan. During his time there, ethnic violence broke out between Armenians and Azeris, and at least 2,000 were killed. He formed a Bolshevik battle squad, comprised mostly of Muslims, to keep the fighting groups apart. According to Montefiore, he wasn't an angel or some kind of vintage human rights activist this time either. He used the conflict to steal printing equipment. Later, he established more of these militias, calling them the Red Battle Squads, which managed to disarm police and military units during the revolution. He was a master of organizing armed resistance, and Koba's reputation grew day by day. But in terms of their activities, whether we call them armed partisanship or terrorism, it is more of a matter of perspective. In Tiflis, for instance, they took over the role of the police for a while and carried out assassinations against the armed forces. On one occasion during the uprising, there was a tragic incident where the Tsarist Cossack infantry fired upon a student gathering, killing 60 of them. In retaliation, he orchestrated 9 attacks against the Cossacks, and he was very effective. At that time, he was kind of a red chieftain, and people called him Koba of Gori. He rapidly ascended the ranks, and in November 1905, the Georgian Bolsheviks chose him as one of the delegates to the party congress in St. Petersburg, along with 2 other party members. Djugashvili wanted to attend the meeting in December under the pseudonym Ivanovich. When he arrived, he met Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, who told him the venue had been moved to Tampere in Finland. But this event was memorable for only one thing. This was the very place where Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin met for the first time. Based on later recollections, the Georgian communists deeply admired Lenin, but disagreed with him that the Bolsheviks should put forward candidates for the upcoming parliamentary elections. After returning home, he established an armed gang called the Bolshevik Expropriators Club, which became known as the Outfit, or Druzhina in Russian. It was a criminal organization with a core of 10 people that recruited children for communication and transportation, as well as carried out armed robberies, assassinations, arms smuggling, extortion, and prison breaks. Djugashvili had only one task: to gather funds for their cause through any means necessary, and he dedicated himself to the mission. In fact, Joseph Stalin's actions in 1905 and the next few years resembled those of the Italian organized crime that began to dominate America at the beginning of the 20th century, making him a kind of Caucasian mob boss. It became clear that Djugashvili preferred force and violence, while peaceful negotiation and compromise were only secondary for him. As the head of the outfit, he arranged assassinations against Mensheviks, and in Tiflis, he ordered schools, including his former theological seminary, to send them money. He seized every opportunity to get money for Lenin, even organized a series of bank robberies, and held up stagecoaches in 1906. He emerged as a leader of bandits, so perhaps it is no mere coincidence that later American westerns became his favorite films. Part of the money thus obtained was sent to Lenin, and the rest was used to finance the Bolshevik press. But before we go any further, let me tell you the story of Joseph Stalin's biggest and most daring bank robbery. About a week after the end of the Russian Revolution, on June 26, 1907, shortly before 11 a.m., 2 carriages arrived at Erevansky Square, the main square of Tiflis. This is the present-day Freedom Square in Tbilisi, where the Tiflis branch of the State Bank of the Russian Empire was located. One of the horse-drawn stagecoaches transported funds from the post office, with 2 armed guards, a bank cashier and an accountant inside, while the other was packed with soldiers and surrounded by mounted Cossacks. By this time, the Tiflis underworld had already heard about the money, and Joseph Stalin, who was by no means averse to violent crimes, seized the opportunity after Lenin, at a meeting in Berlin in April of that year, gave permission to carry out a bank robbery in the Georgian capital. Because of his previous heists, the 28-year-old man had connections with the most notorious underworld criminals, and for an ambush of this magnitude, it was necessary to mobilize serious firepower. The attackers included Druzhina members and Bolshevik supporters. Stalin orchestrated the plan, while an Armenian man named Simon Ter-Petrosian carried it out. The latter was nicknamed Kamo and later became known as the Caucasian Robin Hood. The two took part in several operations together, and according to all recollections, Djugashvili was the planner of the attacks, while Kamo was the executor. Some said about Stalin that despite giving orders, often through his bodyguard, he tried to distance himself from robberies and other crimes. Around 10:30 that morning, 20 men armed with revolvers and hand grenades arrived at Erevonsky Square at their designated places. Kamo came in an open carriage, a phaeton, disguised as a cavalry captain, and then they patiently awaited the arrival of their target. Furthermore, Stalin sent another group to the nearby Tilapuchuri tavern, where the bandits prevented civilians from leaving. He also hired 2 women to be lookouts. However, the authorities also received a tip that criminals could prepare for something, so they increased the security in the square and guarded every corner. The carriages arrived on time, and then, as a signal, one of the gang members discreetly lowered the rolled-up newspaper in his hand, after which one of the groups began hurling grenades at the horses and vehicles. As the Georgian newspaper Isari reported, no one could tell if the terrible shooting was the boom of cannons or explosion of bombs. The sound caused panic everywhere, almost across the whole city. People started running. Carriages and carts were galloping away. The attackers quickly made their way towards the money, but shockingly, one of the injured horses managed to pull the cart away and across the square. The animal almost escaped when one of the robbers suddenly threw another grenade beneath it. The explosion killed the horse, but damaged the carriage too and scattered the banknotes. Stalin's men then tried to collect as much money as possible, but since time was running out, the Caucasian Robin Hood fled the square with 250,000 rubles, which would be worth about $3.56 million, or 3.29 million euros at the time of editing this documentary. Due to the unimaginable chaos, they had to leave 91,000 rubles behind. The disguised Kamo ran into the police reinforcements, to whom he slyly shouted, "The money's safe, run to the square." The trick worked, and he managed to escape. 40 people died in the robbery, including 6 civilians, and another 40 were wounded, while the attackers lost no one. The money was taken to the house of Stalin's local friends, Mika and Maro Bokaridze, and sewn into a mattress, which was then put on the director's couch at the Tiflis Meteorological Observatory. Later, Kamo smuggled the money out of Georgia and delivered it to Lenin in Finland, or at least a significant part of it, because following the robbery, Djugashvili took his family from Tiflis to a seaside house in Baku, but I'll talk about them soon. Despite conducting a thorough investigation, the Tsarist authorities couldn't capture the primary organizers. In addition to Stalin and Lenin, Maxim Litvinov, Alexander Bogdanov, and Leonid Krasin also managed to evade the consequences, and all became prominent Bolsheviks later. Opinions vary regarding Stalin's role in the heist, and it's not entirely certain that he actively participated in the attack. Some claimed he only masterminded the robbery, while others said it was he who launched the attack by dropping the first bomb from one of the rooftops. Others stated that he was waiting at the local train station, ready to flee if things went wrong. Kamo said, however, that Stalin only watched the events from a distance, casually smoking a cigarette. His sister-in-law later mentioned that on the night of the operation, Djugashvili went home and announced the robbery's success. Worth noting that during the 5th Congress of the Social Democrats in London a few weeks earlier in May, the party, which still included the moderate Mensheviks, explicitly prohibited such methods of obtaining money, and because of this, Stalin and Lenin both tried to distance themselves from the robbery. Whether the entire mess was worth it later became quite relative, as it led to conflicts even within the Bolshevik leadership between Lenin and the Bogdanov-Kresin duo, because Lenin wanted to shake off the bloody incident. On top of all this, the Mensheviks felt betrayed and wanted to expel Stalin from the Social Democratic Party. Furthermore, the communists were unable to use most of the loot because the Tsarist police knew the serial numbers of the 500-ruble banknotes. But perhaps the biggest problem for them was that after the Tiflis robbery, the popularity of the Bolsheviks began to fall sharply in the Georgian territories, and their local leaders also had to flee. The only person caught after the bloody massacre was Kamo, who was apprehended in Germany but feigned insanity for over 3 years and successfully avoided a criminal trial. He escaped from his psychiatric ward in 1910, but 2 years later he was arrested again for preparing another robbery. He was sentenced to death, partly because of the events of 1907. His penalty was ultimately reduced to life imprisonment, but he was released during the 1917 revolution. The revolution that destroyed the Tsarist Russian Empire enabled the Bolsheviks to seize power under the leadership of Lenin, and led to the birth of Soviet Russia, which became the Soviet Union in 1922. The bank robbery, which they called expropriation, was a watershed in Stalin's life in many ways. Until then, he was pretty much only the leader of the Bolsheviks in the Caucasus. But in this action, he proved his good organizational skills and that he was a ruthless enforcer. From that day on, he became infamous. In 1907, before the robbery, Djugashvili lived in Tiflis with his first wife, 22-year-old Ekaterina Svanidze, and on March 17th, the couple welcomed their first child, Yakov, who was nicknamed Patsana by his father. The wedding was held on July 16th, 1906, with a church ceremony in the Kulubanskaya church, after the atheist man agreed to his deeply religious mother's wish. However, finding a priest willing to unite a man rebelling against the state and church with his wife was difficult, but a friend from the seminary took on the task, during which Stalin used false documents under one of his pseudonyms, Galiashvili. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't last very long. As I mentioned, following the robbery, the family fled to Baku to avoid arrest, but in the next months, Djugashvili was almost constantly away from home. The 22-year-old Ekaterina found herself in an unknown place, among unknown people, with a newborn, no job, and without her husband. She also worried a lot about her man, and the resulting stress, isolation, and warmer climate took a toll on her health. Despite her family's suggestion to move back home to the Racha region, she was determined to stay with her husband. In October, her condition had deteriorated to the point where Djugashvili decided to bring her back to Tiflis. But unfortunately, she likely consumed water contaminated with typhus during the journey. The Bolshevik bank robber returned to Baku almost immediately and made just one visit to his terminally ill wife, who passed away on November 22, 1907. The funeral service was held 3 days later in the same church where their wedding took place. This was when one of the most famous quotes attributed to Stalin had been allegedly said. According to his childhood friend, the Menshevik Yosip Iramashvili, the grieving husband said, "This creature softened my heart of stone. She died, and with her died my last warm feelings for humanity." According to Iramashvili, Stalin was completely devastated by the death of Ekaterina, who worshipped her husband like a demigod. There were also reports that he told his later female partners that his grief was so deep that his comrades took his gun away from him. Whether it's true or not, Soso reportedly threw himself into her grave and had to be dragged out, but left before the end of the ceremony because agents of the Imperial Secret Police, the Okhrana, were investigating him. This tragic event is perhaps even more dramatic, knowing that as Dmitry Volkogonov, one of the best-known Stalin researchers, mentioned, Ekaterina may have been the only human being he ever truly loved. On the other hand, Simon Sebag Montefiore revealed in his 2007 autobiography of Stalin that the communist revolutionary not only neglected her emotionally, but also physically abused his wife. After the funeral, he left his 8-month-old son in the care of his dead wife's relatives, fled back to Baku, and did not visit him for years. The child stayed with them for the next 14 years, then moved to Moscow in 1921 to live with his father. He not only failed as a husband, but he also treated Yakov, who did not speak Russian, quite poorly. Some said he was particularly annoyed by the boy. He continued to operate the Druzhina without Kamo. They backed workers' strikes, but for example, they looted the ship Nicholas I docked in Baku harbor, raided Baku's naval weapons depot, killed 7 of its guards, and kidnapped rich people's children for ransom. On March 25, 1908, he was arrested again and taken to the Bylov prison in Baku. There, he started learning Esperanto because he considered it the language of the future and organized discussion groups with other Bolsheviks. They also carried out murders behind bars, killing those they suspected were police. Ultimately, the court sentenced him to 2 years of exile in the village of Solvychegodsk, about 650 miles northeast of Moscow. It took him 3 months to get there because he contracted typhus on his way. After his arrival, he lived with 9 other exiles in a communal house. He frequently got into trouble with the police chief and had an affair with a noblewoman and teacher named Stefania Petrovskaya. However, in June, he made a daring escape from the small town disguised as a woman. He didn't stop until St. Petersburg, but the subsequent period was relatively quiet regarding anti-state activities, although his love life remained eventful. In July 1909, Stalin returned to Baku and was arrested again in October, but somehow managed to bribe the police. On March 10, 1910, authorities caught him again, this time in the company of Stefania Petrovskaya. Interestingly, Soso wanted to marry the noblewoman in the prison chapel, but he was again deported to Solvychegodsk for internal exile on the very day the wedding was to take place. The lovers never met again, but Jugashvili wasn't sad for long. He started a relationship with the daughter of a local teacher, the 22-year-old Serafima Koroshenina, also a teacher. By February 1911, they were already living together as cohabiting partners. Even though only church marriages existed in the empire back then, they were still registered as some kind of civil partnership. Montefiore discovered this small detail, which was later completely left out from Stalin's biographies. The two rented a room from a widow, where Koba dedicated his time to writing, reading, and studying. He consumed a lot of history books, delved into the works of Tolstoy, and since he loved nature, he also tried planting pine trees. However, their relationship did not last long either, because the governor of Vologda province exiled Koroshenina to Nikolsk, about 170 miles south of Solvychegodsk. It is not entirely clear why. All that is known is that the woman regularly consumed a visible amount of alcohol. They didn't have a chance to say goodbye, but once again, the loss of her lover didn't bother Yosip for long, as he started a romance with the young widow Maria Kuzakova, from whom they rented the room. She was a mother of 3, whose husband was killed in the Russo-Japanese War. The woman recalled that, while he was there, Stalin was very quiet and gentle with her, and often sang with her children. However, the police repeatedly broke into his room in the middle of the night to search his room. Kuzakova said that she had never seen policemen as afraid of someone as they were of Stalin. His sentence expired on June 26, 1911, and he left the small village straight away. He departed without saying goodbye, but by this time she had already become pregnant and later gave birth to a boy named Konstantin, who was almost certainly Stalin's child. However, the 32-year-old Jugashvili's adventures did not stop there. He was required to stay in Vologda for 2 months, and there he developed a romantic relationship with a 16-year-old high school girl named Pelageya Onufrieva, who was already involved with another Bolshevik. On September 9th, Koba was once again apprehended by the Okhrana, and after being detained for 3 weeks, they forced him into another 3-year exile in Vologda. He lived with a divorced woman there, and probably needless to say, they slept together. A Bolshevik conference took place in Prague in February 1912, but he couldn't attend due to financial reasons and his ongoing sentence, which he probably considered as an optional activity anyway. Despite this, Lenin judged Soso to be reliable and a ruthless executor of Bolshevik interests, and even in his absence, he was elected to the party's Central Committee, a position he held until his death. He did not last long in Vologda. On February 29th, he traveled to St. Petersburg and began the transformation of the Bolshevik press. One of the pivotal moments was when he changed the name of the weekly newspaper Zvezda, which means star in English, to Pravda, meaning truth. The legendary daily newspaper of the world's communists was launched in April 1912, and Stalin became its first editor-in-chief. During this time, he lived with a woman named Tatiana Slavatinskaya, with whom he also had an affair. He faced arrest 2 more times, first in May, after which he was sentenced to exile in Narim, Siberia. This is interesting because there he shared a room with a man named Yakov Sverdlov, but I will talk about him later. After 2 months, though, he managed to escape once more in a canoe, waited for Sverdlov in Tomsk, and together they proceeded to the capital. Then he traveled to Tiflis and orchestrated one last action for the Druzhina. The crew attempted to rob a mail coach, but they failed miserably. Stalin was able to flee, but 18 gang members were apprehended, and the group never reunited again. In September and October 1912, the country held parliamentary elections, and the resulting legislature was known as the Fourth State Duma of the Empire. However, the Social Democratic Labor Party performed poorly, as the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks won only 14 out of the 434 seats. Following the defeat, Stalin proposed in the Pravda that the two factions should cooperate more again, but the idea angered Lenin. This disagreement was just one of many that occurred between the two men. Because of the criticism, Stalin went as far as refusing to publish 47 of Lenin's articles in the upcoming period. In 1913, the secret police raided prominent Bolsheviks and apprehended Stalin during a fundraising masquerade ball in St. Petersburg, which then led to his final exile. The authorities sentenced him to 4 years, but this time they sought a location from which it would be difficult to escape, so they sent Koba together with Sverdlov to Turohansk in Siberia. Nevertheless, in March 1914, the two communists were relocated to Kureika, a small village near the Arctic Circle, since officials suspected the two might attempt to escape again. While he was there, the 35-year-old Stalin started an affair with a 13-year-old orphan girl named Lydia Pereprigina and got her pregnant, but their child died in December, shortly after birth. The barely teenage Lydia became pregnant again in 1916, and their son Alexander was born in April the next year. Stalin himself learned about the child only later, but he didn't show much interest. We can state that his performance as a father was basically equal to nothing, as he neglected all 3 of his sons. While in Kureika, he became close to the indigenous Ostyak and Tungus people, with whom he frequently went hunting and fishing, albeit only out of necessity to stay alive. Due to his time in the seminary, the educated Soso even became a kind of doctor in the area. He played and sang a lot with local children, and sometimes told them about his troubled childhood. The Arctic village was a tough place to live. In addition to the freezing -22 degrees Fahrenheit or -30 degrees Celsius in winter, packs of wolves also lurked around Kureika. The constant danger around him made Stalin more cautious, so when he left the house at night to visit the outhouse lavatory, or for any other reason, he always fired his rifle first to keep the predators away. This experience must have had a significant impact on him, as he often drew wolves on documents during his future meetings. It's unclear if his later suggested paranoia originated from this, but the wolves subconsciously instilled in him the idea that the enemy was constantly circling around him. Despite the harsh circumstances, he enjoyed his time in Kureika. Locals even gifted him a dog, which he named Stepan Timofeyevich, or simply Tishka. On August 17, 1914, following the preliminary warnings and declaration of war, the Russian Empire, driven by Pan-Slavism, entered the First World War with the invasion of East Prussia and Galicia. This move meant that political exiles could potentially be conscripted into military service. Amidst the ongoing conflict with the Germans, the Tsar decided to rename the capital, leaving behind its previous German name. This is how St. Petersburg became the more Russian-sounding Petrograd. However, the Russian army suffered heavy losses from the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As a result, Stalin and many other convicted Bolsheviks were drafted into the army in October 1916. The preliminary army fitness test took place in Krasnoyarsk, but Stalin was found unfit for military service because of his childhood injury to his left arm. Koba, humiliated and ashamed, requested to serve his remaining sentence in Achinsk, a small town in the middle of the country, which he was ultimately granted. And now it's time to explain why I told you all these arrests and exiles. Because rumors started circulating about Stalin, suggesting that given his reputation and criminal history, his relatively light punishments might not have been mere coincidence. He was practically a murderous terrorist bent on overthrowing the state, leading armed groups, killing people, robbing banks, and attacking ships and military installations. Furthermore, he was one of the leading figures of the most violent far-left political formation, and he even dared to defy Lenin sometimes. Not surprisingly, many suspected that the Tsarist secret police might have recruited Stalin. which is why he consistently received sentences of only a few years. Nikolai Veselago, a former Okhrana officer, even recalled that Stalin had reported on Lenin and was forced into exile in February 1912 because another prominent Bolshevik, Roman Malinovsky, had informed the authorities about him. He started using the name Stalin in 1912. It is derived from the Russian word stal, and it means of steel or made of steel, but of course the man of steel undoubtedly has a more appealing ring to it. He claimed that he got the name from his comrades, who thought that such a worker and industrial name suited him and his tough style. However, in Baku and Petrograd, he had a short affair with one Ludmila Stal, another revolutionary and former prisoner who was 6 years older than him. The woman was the daughter of the owner of a steel plant in southern Ukraine, and knowing Stalin, it is hard to imagine that he would have ever admitted that the name of the feared Soviet dictator, one of the most brutal mass murderers of all time, was inspired by a meaningless hookup. There is only one more thing I want to talk about in this chapter: the time he visited Vienna in January 1913 for a Bolshevik meeting where various nationality issues were discussed. But this trip became memorable for another reason, and it usually captures the imagination when people hear about it. Stalin stayed in the apartment of one of their wealthy supporters, Alexander Troyanovsky, while his later great rival, Leon Trotsky, was also present in the city. The future Yugoslav dictator, Josip Broz Tito, who worked at the Daimler car factory in Wiener Neustadt, also lived in Vienna at the time, as did the world-famous psychologist Sigmund Freud, who worked in the Austrian capital. In the Hofburg Imperial Palace, the aging Emperor Franz Joseph lived, and in the Belvedere, Franz Ferdinand resided, whose assassination soon erupted the First World War. But the most interesting fact is that Adolf Hitler, who would become Nazi dictator 20 years later, lived only 9 kilometers away from Joseph Stalin in today's road conditions. However, there is no evidence suggesting they met in Vienna. By 1913, Hitler had already been rejected from the Academy of Fine Arts, resided in a men's dormitory, and earned money by selling his paintings. At the same time, the city was still one of the cultural centers in Europe with vibrant cafe life, so it cannot be completely ruled out, and you can play with the idea that the two men could have passed each other on the street, or that they sat down for a coffee in the same place, not knowing who was sitting at the other table, and unaware of the impact they would have on the world in the years to come. As I previously said, Stalin did not participate in World War I because he was serving his term and was deemed unfit for conscription. After the carriage accident in which both his legs and his left arm were injured, he became somewhat limited in mobility, but his father's beatings and street fights contributed to his subsequent difficulties. He claimed his left arm prevented him from dancing with women since he couldn't hold them by the waist. Stalin had altogether 3 traffic accidents, and the one with the horse-drawn carriage was the most serious. It is unclear if this incident caused his left arm to atrophy, but by adulthood, it was 5.5 centimeters shorter than the other. According to his daughter, Svetlana, he may have suffered some kind of birth injury. Worth noting that, in addition to smallpox, he also suffered from measles and scarlet fever as a child, and just an intriguing fact that he had a webbed left foot. Because of these challenges, he became unfit for military service, but these traumas were merely physical and paved the way for him to become a master conspirator. In February 1917, he was still in Akhinsk, but due to the devastating First World War's severe losses, a strike and then an uprising broke out in Petrograd. In response to the demonstrations, Nicholas II resigned on March 15th, and a provisional government led by Prince Georgy Lvov came to power and attempted to stabilize the tense situation. On March 25th, Stalin returned to Petrograd on board a train accompanied by Lev Kamenev, the later quasi-head of state, and within days they took over the editing of Pravda from Vyacheslav Molotov and sided with the provisional government. Stalin's press was willing to support the cabinet and the continuation of the First World War, as long as the fighting was limited to defensive purposes. He once again opposed Lenin, who wanted to overthrow the provisional government and bring the war to an end. However, Stalin's position abruptly and mysteriously shifted in favor of the coup in mid-April, along with the editorial board. 13 days later, Stalin was elected to the Central Committee with the third most votes, trailing only Lenin and Grigory Zinoviev, one of the old Bolsheviks and the future leader of the Communist International, indicating that his change of heart was not coincidental, and that the new position most likely played a role in the persuasion. During this time, Stalin and Molotov, his future People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, shared an apartment on Shirokaya Street and developed a long-lasting friendship. After the unexpected turnaround, Stalin even topped Lenin, and in June he threatened to quit the committee if they did not support armed uprisings. Following his ultimatum, Bolshevik militias flooded the streets of Petrograd, killing soldiers and demanding the provisional government's resignation. The only issue was that they had no plan to seize power. Neither the Bolshevik leadership nor the Petrograd Soviet wanted to take action. From their perspective, this was a huge mistake that nearly cost Lenin his life, because once their militants dispersed, the new head of the provisional government, Alexander Kerensky, chose to counterattack. On July 18, 1917, they surrounded Bolshevik headquarters and occupied Pravda, while Stalin helped Lenin flee. After his narrow escape, the comrades hid their leader in 5 different places. Stalin eventually shaved Lenin's beard and mustache, took him to the Primorsky station, and smuggled him to Razliv, about 21 miles northwest of Petrograd. He initially lived in a barn, before being forced to relocate to a hastily constructed hay hut owing to approaching authorities. This period, Lenin's absence, is regarded as the first time Stalin took over leadership. Vladimir Ilyich returned to the capital in October and saw that the time had come for an entirely Bolshevik usurpation, which the Central Committee approved 10-2 on October 10th. In parallel, the short-lived Russian Republic was still fighting in the First World War, and Kerensky traveled to the front to mobilize the military. The Bolsheviks occupied the Smolny Institute, set up a command center, and directed their troops from there, who, in Kerensky's absence, stormed and blockaded the Winter Palace with the Aurora cruiser on October 26th and captured most of the members of the government. This action marked the beginning of the Russian Civil War, which was fought primarily between the White and Red armies. The Red Army consisted of Lenin's Bolshevik soldiers, while the White Army was a diverse group that included monarchists, nationalists, liberals, and even separate Marxists. The most important factor that brought these forces together was anti-Bolshevism. To complete the picture, in addition to the Red and White, there was also a Green Army, a group of loosely organized peasants who fought against basically everyone. The Entente powers and the Second Reich were also involved in the conflict. The former wanted to prevent the Bolsheviks from gaining power because they knew that Lenin wanted to withdraw from the war, which would have meant that they would no longer be required to fulfill their alliance commitments. The Germans would be freed from the Eastern Front, and the Russian munitions and supply depots could easily fall into their hands. Despite all the obstacles, the Bolsheviks still prevailed, and on March 3, 1918, they quit the First World War with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, then murdered the Tsar and his family, and set their sights on total power. Stalin left Pravda a little earlier and became the People's Commissar for Nationalities in the Bolshevik government. This was essentially the same as being a minister, and his task was to bring the nationalities of the former empire to their side. By the way, his secretary here was Nadezhda Alliluyeva, whom he later married. He favored the end of the war, despite the anticipated territorial losses, which he considered inevitable. It is also important that compared to Lenin, he saw the European communist movements much more realistically. Whereas his boss felt that a continent-wide proletarian revolution was imminent, Stalin was not convinced. Following the conquest of Petrograd in 1917, Lenin established the 7-member political committee, the Politburo. It was initially established solely to oversee the revolution, but soon it became the party's primary political decision-making body, to which Lenin appointed both Stalin and his later great rival, the former Menshevik Trotsky. In May 1918, however, the leader dispatched Koba to Tsaritsyn, the later Stalingrad, and today's Volgograd. This area was critical to the country's grain, food, and oil supplies. Therefore, his task was to gather as much as he could in a territory that even the White Army besieged at the time. However, this period had profound consequences for the future. First of all, after seizing control of regional military operations, Stalin began to build his military support base after meeting Klement Voroshilov and Semyon Budyonny, his later allies. In 1935, both were among the Soviet Union's first 5 marshals. In addition, he confronted Lev Trotsky for the first time in Tsaritsyn, who was the head of the Revolutionary Military Council, Stalin's superior, and who also recruited former Tsarist officers into the Red Army for their expertise. Stalin, on the other hand, did not trust them and confiscated documents that he planned to use as evidence to expose their espionage, and ultimately executed many of them. This conflict between the two led to the point where he even asked Lenin for Trotsky's removal. Even then, his ruthlessness was evident in the executions of their opponents, often without a trial, whom they labeled as counter-revolutionaries. He even ordered the burning of many rural villages to the ground to subjugate the population and dissuade looters of food shipments. Stalin's main weapon was the dreaded executor of the Red Terror, the Cheka, the organization partially created from the Okhrana, also the predecessor of the NKVD, the KGB, and today's FSB. In March 1919, at the age of 40, he married his second wife, the aforementioned 17-year-old Nadezhda Alliluyeva, and they had 2 children, Vasily in 1921 and Svetlana in 1926. Nadezhda was born in Baku and knew Soso from an early age because her father, Sergei, a committed party member, often hid Bolsheviks in their home after they moved to St. Petersburg, and this is how Stalin came to know them. Sergei first met Stalin in Baku in 1904, when Nadezhda was only 3 years old, and the girl became more and more involved in the communist movement over the years. Furthermore, the family even hosted Lenin himself in 1917, during the so-called July Days, when the Bolsheviks organized armed demonstrations in Petrograd, after which Lenin had to flee to Finland to avoid arrest. In May 1919, Stalin was ordered to return to Petrograd, where he upheld strict order by publicly executing deserters. His brutal approach achieved results, and although even the Bolshevik leadership was concerned, he demonstrated firmness, determination, and willingness to take responsibility. In the meantime, the Second Polish Republic, led by President Józef Pilsudski, set out to restore the country's 18th century borders. Meanwhile, Lenin saw Poland as a bridge in the fight for proletarian internationalism, so the Bolsheviks, already busy but in a favorable position in the Civil War, saw that the time had come to turn their attention to the West. The precursor to this was the founding of the Communist International in March 1919 under Lenin's leadership, which, among other things, aimed to achieve the ideological transition of the world and the defeat of the bourgeoisie. Lenin and his comrades believed that they needed to conquer Paris and Berlin in order to seize power in Europe, but the route there led through Warsaw, while the Poles wanted to push the border at least 200 kilometers east of the Curzon Line, so neither side had to be forced into an armed conflict. The Polish army marched eastward and managed to occupy eastern Galicia. However, the conquest of Kiev on May 7th didn't bring undivided success among the locals, many of whom joined the Red Army instead. On May 26th, Stalin was sent to Ukraine, and initially the communists avoided major battles. But in June 1920, they launched a counterattack and recaptured Kiev on June 10th and continued their offensive until Warsaw. The Battle of Warsaw was fought between August 12th and 25 and was miraculously won by the Poles. This victory is considered one of history's most important triumphs because the defeat of the Red Army also slowed the expansion of communism in the West. Foreigners also supported Polish war efforts. For instance, their closest friends, the Hungarians, supplied them with ammunition. Stalin himself opposed the war. He considered Western expansion unrealistic and premature, but Lenin thought otherwise. Moreover, he also correctly predicted that the invasion of Poland would incite local nationalism and unify Poles against the Red Army. And so it happened. During the Battle of Warsaw, the entire population fought together. They were even able to form separate women's military units from volunteers. The pessimistic Stalin was assigned to the southwestern Ukrainian front alongside Alexander Yegorov, the third later marshal, and the two did not carry out many central orders that came from Lenin or Trotsky. For example, he was partly blamed for the defeat in Warsaw because, as a political commissar, he refused to countersign the reinforcements requested, citing administrative reasons. Instead, he focused on taking Lviv, a strategy that also failed. The Soviets lost the war eventually, and in August he had to defend himself in the political committee, but he insisted that the war was a bad idea and that the army was unprepared for an invasion. Lenin, Trotsky, and Mikhail Tukhachevsky, commander of the Battle of Warsaw and the future Fourth Marshal, blamed Stalin for the defeat, and on September 1st, he resigned from his army positions. The same month, Trotsky again sharply attacked him at a Bolshevik conference and accused him of sabotaging the war. Nobody defended the humiliated Stalin, but it is now clear that he was right about the possibilities of war. He and Trotsky did not particularly like each other anyway, but this incident irrevocably destroyed their relationship, and Stalin did not forget. The Bolsheviks, fearing a possible foreign, primarily German attack, made Moscow the capital again on March 12, 1918, after a gap of more than 200 years. This meant that the Kremlin once again became the seat of power and the political center of the new state. Then on August 30th, 1918, Lenin visited and gave a speech at the Hammer and Sickle weapons factory in southern Moscow. A large crowd gathered, and the speech was a success. However, as he was leaving just before he got into the car, a female voice called his name and shot him 3 times. A bullet pierced his coat, another landed in his left shoulder, and a third punctured his left lung before stopping near his right collarbone, but his neck was also injured. The assassin was Fanny Kaplan, an anarchist who had become disillusioned with Lenin. Her previous years in prison had left her half-blind, and a few days after her attack, the Cheka executed her. Lenin barely survived the attack because he refused to leave the Kremlin for medical treatment, thus the doctors could not remove the bullets from his body. He eventually survived, but from then on, his health gradually deteriorated. Following the civil war and the assassination attempt, he suffered from severe headaches and insomnia, as well as seizures and fainting spells. He couldn't keep up his previous rigorous work pace, and he felt endless exhaustion more and more often. In his last years, a total of 26 doctors were commissioned to find out what made him so ill, but they were unable to find a solution. On the advice of German doctors, the bullets were removed from him, and then a syphilis test was allegedly performed on him, which, contrary to common belief, came back negative. Of course, since we are talking about an emerging dictatorship, the skeptics wondered whether the authorities would conceal the truth about Lenin, who had already been elevated to the status of a redeemer by his followers. Syphilis is difficult to diagnose because its symptoms are similar to those of many other diseases. A bacterium causes the infection, which begins as an ulcerated wound and subsequently spreads throughout the body, including the brain. It is followed by fever, rashes, and malaise, and after the initial stage, the disease can remain in the body for years, oscillating between being sick and being healthy. Symptoms can be extremely severe, including headaches, nervous system disorders, and gastrointestinal, muscle, and joint pain. In the late stages, often 20 years after infection, the patient experiences mood swings and dementia, as well as depression and lethargy. Over time, damage to the cardiovascular system can lead to paralysis, aneurysms, and strokes. The disease could not be effectively cured until 1943 when penicillin was discovered. Lenin suffered his first stroke on May 26, 1922, which left him unable to speak for a while and paralyzed his right arm, but he slowly managed to recover somewhat. At that time, he was recuperating south of Moscow in the estate of Gorky, his personal dacha, a suburban or rural rest house. He returned to the old new capital in October, but had another stroke in December. Stalin frequently visited him there, and just like during Vladimir Ilyich's stay in Finland, he remained the voice for the dying leader, thereby increasing his importance. However, in the background, he had already begun to organize the takeover of power. He decided, for example, who could meet with Lenin. Even though Stalin had saved his life, the relationship between the two had already become strained. This was exacerbated by Stalin's yelling at Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, during a phone call. But Lenin was also upset because, in addition to his illness, they attempted to remove Trotsky from power. He himself would certainly have preferred Trotsky as his successor, and in 1922 they united against Stalin's growing influence. And at the 12th Party Congress in April 1923, he instructed Trotsky to hold Stalin accountable for the violent Sovietization of Georgia. In short, in February 1921, Lenin and Trotsky wanted to bring the Caucasus country under their control by sparking an internal insurrection against the Menshevik government and then rushing to aid the insurgents with the Red Army. However, Stalin did not want to complicate things. Instead, he urged immediate military intervention, Sovietization, and power seizure. Lenin finally gave his consent, and they intervened in Georgia. But Stalin was dissatisfied with the course of events. He thought that the new government treated the opposition too lightly and disliked their desire to retain sovereignty from Moscow. Stalin arrived in Tiflis in early July 1921 and quickly began personnel replacements to crush the hydra of nationalism. Even in the local Cheka, he made changes, removing the Georgian chief, Kot Sinsadze, and his lieutenants, and replacing them with people who were much more ruthless and loyal to him. The most noteworthy move of this reorganization was the appointment of Bloodthirsty Beria, a 22-year-old ambitious Georgian Bolshevik who was promoted to deputy chairman of the Georgian Cheka in the following year, which previously changed its name from Cheka to GPU and then to OGPU. The conflict ended when the Georgians joined the Soviet Union on December 30, 1922, with the Trans-Caucasian SFSR. This series of events is referred to as the Georgian Affair. Since April 3, 1922, Stalin had been General Secretary of the Central Committee. In this regard, it's worth mentioning that one of his predecessors was the previously mentioned Yakov Sverdlov. Everyone is familiar with the three most prominent Bolsheviks, Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky. Although there were many others, Yakov Sverdlov reached great heights during his short life and was unquestionably the fourth horseman. At the age of 22, for example, he became the chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee and a year later chairman of the Secretariat of the Russian Communist Party, which was more akin to a party director position at the time. He was considered Lenin's closest confidant, who died unexpectedly in March 1919. Kremlin doctors claimed the Spanish flu was responsible for his death, but there are theories that it may have been caused by typhus or poison. He was known to have exceptional organizational skills, but also supported the Red Terror, gave the order to burn Fanny Kaplan's body, and although this was not preserved in official documents, ordered the execution of the Tsar and his family a month and a half earlier. True crime fans may be familiar with the horrifying Dyatlov Pass incident, in which 9 members of a hiking group perished in mysterious circumstances. An interesting coincidence is that the ski trip started in Sverdlovsk and their tragic demise occurred in the Sverdlovsk Oblast. So he was one of Stalin's predecessors in this repeatedly renamed position, from which Lenin intended to remove Koba at the party congress. But a month before, on March 9, 1923, he suffered his third and final stroke. Robert J. Service, professor of Russian history at the University of Oxford, however, revealed an intriguing contradiction about him. The expert claimed that between his strokes, Lenin twice requested poison to end his suffering. In 1923, Stalin allegedly sent a note to the political committee in which he confessed that Lenin had asked him to get him a dose of potassium cyanide. He also wrote that while he could not refuse Lenin's request, he did not have the capacity to carry it out either. The reason Lenin's wish is a contradiction is that within Bolshevik circles, his name was synonymous with lifelong suffering and fighting to the end. Thus, the Congress did not hear the speech he prepared about Stalin's marginalization, and Trotsky alone did not dare confront the man of steel, opening the door for the son of the alcoholic Georgian cobbler to become the all-powerful ruler of the world's largest country. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin died on January 21, 1924. The autopsy found that severe atherosclerosis in his cerebral arteries, which were almost completely blocked, caused his repeated strokes. His death is particularly unusual considering his healthy, active, and self-disciplined lifestyle. He did not tolerate cigarettes near him and only drank alcohol moderately. Lenin displayed symptoms of syphilis, but his body did not exhibit the typical brain, heart, or bone damage associated with neurosyphilis that some doctors suggested. This is why his case continues to divide experts, and the fact that many of the documents related to his death are still classified to this day further hinders the research process. However, given that his father died of a stroke at the age of 54, almost the same age as Lenin, and that 3 of his siblings also died of cardiovascular disease, it is likely that he suffered from some kind of hereditary genetic disease too, in addition to the serious health consequences of the assassination. Stalin's full takeover took many years, but initially it was important to him to be seen as Lenin's unambiguous heir. For example, he organized his funeral and was also among those who carried his coffin. The leader's embalmed body was eventually placed in a first wooden, then granite mausoleum at the Red Square, against his wife's will. The building of Lenin's personal cult accelerated as well, as public places, factories, and schools were named after him. But for example, 5 days following his death, the old capital, Petrograd, was also renamed Leningrad. Before his death, the Bolshevik leader dictated a sort of testament in which he criticized both Trotsky and Stalin and called for the latter's replacement. The letter was given to the Central Committee by his wife, but some believe it was authored by Nadezhda Krupskaya, who had a rather bad relationship with Stalin. However, the text had no particular consequences for the General Secretary, and in the following years, internal power struggles once again stressed the Soviet leadership. The 2 frontmen were Stalin and Trotsky, but since the former was the General Secretary, also a member of the Central Committee, and in charge of personnel matters, the latter's room for maneuver was constrained. Stalin began to utilize the secret police against his opposition within the party, which was led by Trotsky, making their efforts hopeless and futile. The rivalry between the two finally came to an end in October 1927, when Trotsky was removed from the party and the Central Committee after the opposition held a street demonstration on the 10th anniversary of the revolution. After that, he was first deported to Kazakhstan in January 1928, and then expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929. In the coming years, he resided in Turkey, France, Norway, and eventually Mexico, where he was assassinated by the NKVD, the new organization that inherited the powers of the OGPU in the 1930s. On August 20, 1940, Ramon Mercader, a Spanish-born NKVD officer, attacked him in his study with an ice axe and gravely injured him in the head. Trotsky's bodyguards were then able to subdue the man, and the politician was rushed to the hospital, but died the next day. Stalin ordered his execution because Trotsky actively wrote in exile and harshly denounced Stalinism. In response, the authorities staged show trials in Moscow, branding Trotsky and the old communists who were declared his allies as terrorists and accusing them of attempting to overthrow Stalin and the leadership. Everyone was found guilty, and Trotsky, whom the Soviet authorities accused of interfering in the country's internal affairs from abroad, was sentenced to death in absentia. From then on, his name became a curse word, and in the future, propaganda portrayed him as the leader of every organization they saw as opposition. Stalin encountered growing challenges starting in the late 1920s. The country was significantly falling behind in the race for industrialization, exacerbated by inadequate housing, which ultimately reduced the standard of living, and many workers were essentially forced into living in camp-like conditions. But the most serious crisis was caused by the grain shortage. It is worth mentioning that he was not yet a dictator in the conventional sense at that time, and he was repeatedly criticized in the Central Committee. Such a problematic issue was his dekulakization policy, in which farms and crops were confiscated by force, particularly after 1928. The term kulak was used by the Bolsheviks to refer to the upper peasant class, who became wealthy farmers as a result of the land reforms preceding World War I. Lenin considered them class enemies and blood-sucking vampires, who solely wanted to exploit the poor, even during times of hunger. But in fact, it was just a political tool to blame someone rather than admitting the government's mistakes and taking responsibility. In such circumstances, it is a cheap political trick to play on people's envy and attack the wealthier. Almost anyone could be classified as a kulak. For example, those who had a few more cows or 2 to 3 hectares more of land than their neighbor could already be stigmatized. They even organized grain requisitioning squads. In Novosibirsk, for instance, kulaks were arrested and their grain seized so that authorities could transport it to Moscow. Nikolai Bukharin and several Central Committee members criticized the measures as being too hasty. By July 1930, however, 300,000 households had already been affected to some extent by the dekulakization, and the accused were either relocated to other parts of the country, especially to the Urals and Central Asia, transported to labor camps, or executed. I'm not talking about this without a reason, because the man-made famine and action against the wealthier farmers were Joseph Stalin's first extensive domestic terror. The famine worsened even further, owing to both the weather and poor political decisions. Because of him, hundreds of thousands of peasants who knew how to cultivate the land were punished. Furthermore, as part of the first 5-year plan, launched in 1928 and aimed at bolstering heavy industry, forced collectivization of agriculture began too. The cornerstone of this was the so-called kolkhozization, which meant that in principle voluntarily, but in practice, rather out of fear and intimidation, the peasants could jointly cultivate their collectivized lands. Stalin also banned the kulaks from joining the kolkhozes, worsening the already terrible Soviet agricultural situation. Because of volunteerism, the rural population initially refused to participate in the kolkhozization. Therefore, the authorities used the previously mentioned intimidation. The masses didn't intend to swallow everything, and uprisings broke out against dekulakization, for example in Ukraine and the Caucasus, but the Red Army cruelly suppressed them. Whether these clashes had anything to do with one of the most horrific genocides in the history of mankind that took place in Ukraine and partly in the Caucasus cannot be known for sure, because no official document indicating this has been preserved. However, there is little doubt that Stalin's kulak policy had the most profound impact on Ukrainian agriculture. The harvest fell short of expectations year after year, while the number of horses that could be harnessed for field work fell from 36 million in 1928 to 21 million by 1941, and except for the pig, all species of livestock disappeared in the millions. For example, in the first 3 months of 1930, forced collectivization led the peasantry in the Voronezh area to slaughter 25% of their cattle, 53% of their pigs, 40% of their poultry, and 55% of their sheep. Soviet agriculture only recovered from this massacre by the late 1950s, when farm animal stock numbers rose back to 1928 levels. From April 1930, the use of the infamous Gulag system was intensified. These labor camps had already existed since 1919, but their already vast network was greatly expanded under Stalin's rule. Historians believe that up to 25 million people were transferred to the Gulags, but the actual number is unknown due to the difficulty of researching the years before 1929. At their peak, in 1953, a total of 1.7 million people were incarcerated in these institutions. The Gulags were Stalin's most cruel form of political retribution. The inmates, who were frequently forced to work at -50 degrees Celsius or -58 degrees Fahrenheit, were also ravaged by typhoid and scurvy, and the weak and underperforming individuals were shot dead as saboteurs. Beatings, torture, executions, and rapes were regular. Human life meant nothing there. The communists viewed the Gulag system as the re-education of class enemies, but only a few survived those conditions. Among the toughest were the Gulags created from the Nazi camps in East Germany after World War II, such as in Mühlberg, Buchenwald, Pfannenfreichen, and Sachsenhausen. In the Soviet Union, the most terrifying camps were those that were either built within or near the Arctic Circle, or were linked to large-scale constructions, such as the Stalin White Sea-Baltic Canal. To name a few, the Solovetsky Special Camp, the Bamlag, which was established for the construction of the Siberian Railway, the Sevotslag in the Kolyma region, which was responsible for road construction and gold mining, the Norilsk in Norilsk, where prisoners mined copper and nickel, the Vorkutlag, a coal mine in the Arctic Circle, and finally the Karlag in Kazakhstan. The latter, however, was not connected to a temporary construction site, but was a permanent labor camp, and since it was a crime for the Soviet citizens to be relatives of traitors, not only convicts, but also their family members were transported there. As a result, 1,507 children were born here between 1931 and 1959. Back to the famine. The communists caused such a major food crisis in Ukraine that between 1930 and 1933, some estimates suggest up to 7 million people may have starved to death after they were simply deprived of all their food. The party assigned Vyacheslav Molotov to the country, and he gave the order that once the requisitioning squads had collected all the grain, they should proceed with the potatoes and all the vegetables they could find. The authorities dug up the fields and took everything from the storages, even from the hidden ones. The horrible genocide committed in the Ukrainian SSR is known as the Holodomor, in which millions died of starvation so that the Soviet leadership could sell a large part of the confiscated livestock and crops abroad in exchange for foreign currency. The emaciated corpses were taken by train to Kyiv, and no one understood how the Soviet leaders could allow this to happen. But the General Secretary himself forbade the peasants to go to the cities for food. As millions were dying of starvation across the country, newspapers, radios, and movies depicted an entirely different reality, as dictatorships are not strangers to using propaganda to obscure the country's difficulties. They presented green fields, joyful workers, laughing young girls, bountiful crops, and incredible production rates. One Alexei Stakhanov became the face of the latter, who, according to propaganda, mined 14 times his quota in a coal mine in eastern Ukraine in just 5 hours and 45 minutes on August 31, 1935. Later, he reportedly broke this record as well, and today if you hear somewhere that someone is called a Stakhanovite or Stakhanovist, it refers to the most persistent workers. Beyond Trotsky, the regime also mastered the continuous creation of state enemies. For example, the regime saw economic problems as sabotage. Many show trials were held in the late 1920s and 1930s against engineers, scientists, economists, Trotskyists, and party members of alleged right-wing deviation, accusing them of conspiring against the state. These trials were built around fabricated accusations, such as the previously mentioned sabotage of the Soviet economy or preparations for a coup against the upper leadership. Prison sentences were the most common, but there were also many examples of the death penalty. Of course, you had to get to the show trials somehow. For the Soviet authorities, this meant weeks of torture, and in every case, the judges and prosecutors were Stalin's men. The best known among them was Andrei Vyshinsky, Stalin's state prosecutor appointed on May 11, 1931, who eventually succeeded Molotov as Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1949. It is worth highlighting the 1931 lawsuit against former Menshevik party members, who were accused of attempting to rebuild their movement. They were all economists, but 6 of the 14 defendants in this case were Jewish, and the communists of Jewish descent suspected anti-Semitism behind the procedure. Stalin denied this, although his alleged anti-Semitism will also be discussed regarding his death. In the following years, he reorganized all areas of life starting with education, culture, and religious life. In the latter, he put priests, imams, and representatives of other religions on trial and destroyed many religious buildings. The most notorious example of this was the destruction of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow on December 5, 1931, because they planned to erect the gigantic palace of the Soviets in its place. The foundation was only laid in January 1939, but the German invasion cut the project short 2 years later, and it was never finished, making the eradication of the church pointless. Joseph Stalin vigorously attacked the symbols of the pre-Bolshevism Russian Empire, particularly religion, which he believed only deceived people and distorted their sense of judgment. In 1933, the unthinkable famine and the deaths of millions prompted the overhaul of family policy too, with a focus on motherhood and strengthening families, which resulted in the criminalization of homosexuality and restrictions on abortion and divorce. It is worthwhile to dive more into the Bolshevik family concept, as they often struggled to establish their driving values. For example, they initially rejected the traditional family model, seeing it as a breeding ground for the bourgeoisie and capitalism via private property and inheritance. Because of this, during the Civil War, they proclaimed full gender equality, which is undoubtedly a wonderful idea, but it wasn't well received by the majority of the population, who had previously lived a patriarchal agricultural life for centuries. Moreover, for the Bolsheviks, the main aspect of women's equal rights was that, while they created the opportunity for their education, they could easily get cheap labor in the millions for the Soviet industry. Therefore, the 1918 Code on Marriage, Family, and Guardianship emphasized individual rights within marriage. It simplified divorce procedures, replaced church weddings with civil ones, and legalized abortion. They were so anti-family that they even prohibited adoption, ensuring that the children would grow up in the state's care and receive a Marxist education. However, the Bolsheviks did not account for a few factors, such as the unmanageable number of orphans, as nearly 7 million children lost their parents in the Civil War, the difficulty for the economy to absorb the inexperienced female workforce, resulting in higher unemployment, and the lack of protection for women in divorce cases. This meant that in the case of a divorce, the husband may dispose of all common family property without dividing it. This was altered 8 years later by the Family Code of 1926, which required an equal distribution of property acquired during marriage. In addition, the concept of collective paternity was also introduced, which meant that multiple men could be ordered to pay alimony if the father of a child couldn't be determined. Children, parents, siblings, and grandparents all received alimony as part of family obligations. In 1936, a new law was passed that veered almost completely from the initial anti-family Marxist ideals to strengthen the family as the fundamental social unit. It's important to note that by then, over 10 million people had died since the Bolsheviks came to power, and widespread family propaganda was ordered to support the new direction. Here are a few new policies aimed at encouraging both pregnancy and childbirth. The new law banned abortion and imposed fines and jail time on those who received or performed the service. In addition to pregnancy leave and job security, the law established childcare services and offered financial support for large families. Divorce became more difficult after lawmakers required both parties to appear in court and pay a fine. The 1936 law and the subsequent campaign sought to elevate the mother's cohesive role in the family to the level of Stakhanovite workers, portraying motherhood as a patriotic way of life. Stalin also participated in the propaganda and often appeared in photographs with smiling children. Due to the devastating impacts of World War II, the Family Edict of 1944 further expanded the benefits for mothers and ordered singles and childless married couples to pay additional taxes. Longer maternity leave and higher family allowances were granted to unmarried mothers. More childcare services were provided, and even a special official honor called Mother Heroine was bestowed upon women with large families. Divorces were made even more difficult by increasing fines, ordering public court hearings, and publishing divorce cases in the local newspapers to put pressure on the once happy couples. All in all, it can therefore be stated that within a few years, the far-left Bolsheviks who were adamantly anti-family, shifted to a right-wing conservative family policy. However, the measures were hardly successful because between 1926 and 1974, the projected birth rate decreased from 44 to 18 per thousand people. Of course, it should be noted once again that military conflict and starvation claimed the lives of 18 million Russian and Soviet citizens in World War I and the Civil War, 10 million in the 1930s, and 27 million in World War II. According to the 1926 census, 82% of the population lived in the countryside, and due to the severe famine of the early 1930s, peasants emigrated in large numbers from their lands. The Soviet government tried to prevent the desolation of the countryside by introducing a new passport system in 1933, without which the peasants could not move into cities, travel between the Soviet republics, or take a train. This was the period when they were forbidden to go to the cities for food because they had to obtain special permission if they wanted to leave the village. Their applications were all assessed by the leaders of the collective farms or rural councils, and if the peasants continued to leave without permission, they would face various punishments, including being sent to the Gulag. Meanwhile, Stalin's second marriage did not go well either. He and Nadezhda often quarreled, and she felt that he kept her in mental terror, neglected her and their children, and made it impossible to live with him. The tormented wife held on to Stalin until November 9, 1932, when she committed suicide in her room, following an argument after an evening reception held in the Kremlin. Officials attributed her death to complications from appendicitis, and for some reason, those who knew the truth believed she had failed her husband during a trying time. Stalin probably had a hard time during the funeral because he did not remain the entire time and stormed off. Later, he painted himself as the victim, claiming that his wife had crippled him because he and the children would have needed her so much. From these years, I'd like to highlight a megalomaniacal and poorly executed project that mirrored the priorities of the dictatorship. This project was the construction of the Stalin White Sea-Baltic Canal, which began in 1931 during the worst famine and ended in 1933. The water corridor, which connects the White Sea to Lake Onega, bore his name until 1961 and is now known as the White Sea-Baltic Canal. The sole purpose of this construction was to complete it faster than the Americans did with the Panama Canal 20 years earlier. The dictator himself attended the inauguration, but due to haste, the channel was only 3.5 meters deep instead of the planned 4.5 meters, making it only usable by smaller ships. As a result, it did not become as economically significant as expected, but the most tragic aspect is that by the time Stalin's vision was realized, over 30,000 forced laborers had died. Unfortunately, they managed to surpass the French-American project in this comparison as well, as up to 25,000 people may have died throughout the entire construction of the canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans due to the heat and tropical diseases. For a long time, Stalin struggled to gain acceptance because the Russian majority population viewed the Georgian leader with suspicion. Therefore, to improve popularity, while he appointed loyal people to important positions, he also made sure that those people were Russians, if feasible. As his power grew in the 1930s, he also seemed to change mentally. A psychiatrist had previously diagnosed him with paranoia, but I will explain this later. The General Secretary constantly feared that foreign powers were planning an attack on the Soviet Union, hence they signed a series of international non-aggression pacts and strengthened counter-espionage domestically. A sad episode of this process occurred in September 1934, when he ordered the execution of workers at the Stalin metallurgical factory on charges of spying for Japan. 3 months later, the 5-foot-tall, thin Leonid Nikolaev assassinated an old friend of the dictator. The victim was Sergei Kirov, a Politburo member and first secretary of the Leningrad City Committee, and the location was the Bolsheviks' emblematic building, the Smolny Institute. The man was quickly sentenced to death, and the murder was determined an opposition action. From then on, Stalin became even more afraid of assassination attempts against him, so he increased his personal security and appeared less often in public. In 1935, he ordered the NKVD to expel suspected counter-revolutionaries from urban areas, which affected 11,000 people in Leningrad alone. Beginning in 1936, a series of show trials were held against leading communists, including Central Committee members Bukharin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, and all of them were sentenced to death. However, the purge did not only target prominent figures. Stalin ordered mass expulsions from the entire party. In May 1937, he even attacked the army's leadership before expanding the arrests to the entire society. Meanwhile, on June 4, 1937, he lost another family member after his mother died of heart failure. Over the years, the relationship between the two was quite restrained, as Stalin rarely visited his mother in Gori, especially after he came to power. He went to see her only twice in the 1920s, in 1921 and 1926. Otherwise, they only corresponded via letters, but the dictator wrote less and less after the death of his second wife. Stalin visited Ekaterina for the last time on October 17, 1935, when she was already ill. And according to her doctor's recollections, the following conversation allegedly took place between mother and son. "Mama, do you remember our Tsar?" "Well, I'm something like the Tsar," he said, to which his mother responded, "You'd have done better to become a priest," because she believed that in contrast to how little priests work, they live well and are greatly respected. Because of the domestic political turmoil, he did not attend his mother's funeral. Instead, he sent Beria with a wreath that had the message, "To a dear and beloved mother, from your son, Iosif Jugashvili, Stalin." The Great Purge between 1936 and 1938 was another dramatic chapter of Stalin's rule, which inevitably backfired in World War II. For example, Stalin ordered the torture of one of the country's marshals, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who, along with Trotsky and Lenin, blamed Stalin for the Battle of Warsaw defeat in the Polish-Soviet War. Like many others, the NKVD's methods broke him, forcing him to testify that he was a German agent who conspired with Nikolai Bukharin to acquire power. His confession, dated May 25, 1937, still bears blood marks to this day. The General Secretary's goal was to solidify his control within the party and the country, while also eliminating Trotsky's remaining influence, who was still active abroad at the time. Due to mass starvation and forced agricultural collectivization, many people lost faith in Stalin. He only gained full power over the party in 1928, but in the early 1930s, particularly around 1934, a growing number of people, including Trotsky, dared to suggest that Stalin be removed from power. We can imagine how the former bank robber reacted, who even used his friend's assassination for his own purposes. The investigation into Sergei Kirov's assassination revealed a network of party members and other high-ranking people plotting against Stalin. Historians believe that this could have been the moment when the dictator decided to carry out the brutal massacre. To see the extent of it, out of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, namely Mikhail Tukhachevsky, known as Red Napoleon, Semyon Budyonny, Kliment Voroshilov, Vasily Bluer, and Alexander Yegorov, only Voroshilov and Budyonny survived the purge. According to conservative estimates, at least 700,000 individuals were executed during the genocide between 1936 and 1938, with another 110,000 dying in the gulags. But the total number could be well over 1 million due to the NKVD's systematic torture. The head of the NKVD at that time was Nikolai Yezhov, and in 1937, Stalin himself gave him a quota of executions and deportations, which was split among the member republics, and from then on, an average of 1,000 people were slaughtered every day. The directive was that it's better to go too far than not far enough, and the slaying of Leon Trotsky in 1940 was part of this mass murder. However, Yezhov, also known as the Dwarf or the Bloody Dwarf, slowly lost Stalin's trust, though not because of his own deeds. On June 3, 1938, one of Yezhov's high-ranking NKVD protégés, Genrikh Yushkov, defected from the country, and Yezhov was concerned that Stalin would blame him for the incident. Well, he was right, because 2.5 months later, Lavrenti Beria, who had been transferred from the Caucasus, was appointed his deputy. Worth noting that the dwarf attempted to arrest him at the beginning of the year, but Beria personally traveled to Stalin and persuaded him not to execute him, and that his achievements thus far showed his unconditional loyalty. So Beria became his deputy and gradually took over control from Yezhov, who, sensing the wind of change, turned to alcoholism and initiated a divorce from his wife. On April 10, 1939, the enforcer of the Great Purge was arrested, and authorities tried to keep his case as secret as possible. Despite being accused of espionage and conspiracy, he consistently maintained his devotion to Stalin. But his loyalty still didn't save him. Yezhov was tortured and sentenced to death, and on February 4, 1940, he was shot dead in the basement of a Moscow NKVD building by later KGB boss Ivan Serov. He had already been stripped of his positions, and in November 1938, Lavrenti Beria took over as head of the NKVD. By the way, Yezhov is also known as the most famous victim of Soviet history manipulation and early image editing, as he was mercilessly removed from official images. Jumping back a bit, in 1938, another interesting event happened. Everyone is probably familiar with the image of the late Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev kissing East German leader Erich Honecker on the lips. It is less known, but Stalin also used this form of greeting. On March 17th, for instance, the Soviet plane that had reached America by touching the North Pole arrived back in Moscow. The pilot of this plane was Valery Chkalov, with whom they kissed on the lips in the middle of the crowd. The General Secretary had already welcomed Chkalov in this manner in 1936, and another photograph captured him kissing another pilot, Vasily Molokov too, in 1937. This is the so-called Soviet kiss, which many communist politicians did in the 20th century. And now we arrive at World War II, which is such a huge topic that one could talk about it for days, but I tried to keep it brief. In 1939, the Soviet Union was more or less over the Great Purge. At the time, the country was highly isolated in the diplomatic arena, as the long-expected worldwide communist revolution, predicted since Lenin, had still not occurred. The Americans, the British, and the French hesitated to associate with them, while Adolf Hitler elevated anti-communism to new levels in the 1930s, as the Third Reich arose from the ashes of World War I as a strong economic and military power. Because of the relative isolation, Stalin concluded several non-aggression pacts in the decades between World War I and World War II. In 1921, for example, they signed an agreement with Persia, Afghanistan, and Turkey, seeking some legitimacy as Western nations did not recognize the world's first communist state until 1924. So the Nazis dealt cruelly with the communists too. The burning of the Reichstag in 1933, 4 weeks after the later Führer's inauguration, was one of the best-known episodes of this, leading to the persecution of the German far left. It's important to understand the nature of the conflict between the Nazis and the communists. One might think that the Nazis were a far-left organization due to their full name, and it may cause a misunderstanding, but this is not the case. Of course, there were similarities in measures such as the nationalizations, and the name National Socialist German Workers' Party may imply a left-wing group, but Adolf Hitler addressed this contradiction in an interview in 1923, long before he came to power. He defined socialism as the science of dealing with the common weal, originating from the ancient Aryan Germans, who once held certain lands in common and cultivated the idea of the commonweal. Hitler said communism and Marxism are not socialism. They just stole the term, confused its meaning, and hid behind it. He believed that socialism did not repudiate private property and did not negate personality. As he stated, unlike communism, their socialism was not internationalist. Rather, it was national and patriotic, the reason they eventually became the National Socialist Party. He believed that state and race must have been one, so a person was first a member of the national body based on race, followed by anything else. The communists, on the other hand, saw the homogeneity of society and the abolition of classes, not on a racial basis. so the Nazis believed that Aryans should make up the majority of the population, whereas communists wanted workers to be the majority. This was the ideological reason for their conflict. Upon assuming power, Hitler immediately began combating the communists in Germany, and the disparaging propaganda against them often affected the Jews as well. The practical reason was that he wanted to eliminate the communists as soon as possible, because like most Western European countries, they were concerned about the rise of the far left. Before the parliament was torched, the Nazi Party emerged victorious in the German general elections held on November 6, 1932, securing 33.1% of the vote and the most seats. However, the Social Democrats, who came in second, and the Communists, who placed third, would have received more mandates combined. On January 30, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor. Exactly 4 weeks later, the Reichstag burned down, and events accelerated. The Communist and Social Democratic parties were soon banned, and many of their leaders and members were arrested, taken to concentration camps, or killed. For most of the 1930s, the relatively isolated Soviets were continually engaged in border skirmishes in the Far East with the expanding Imperial Japan. In the meantime, the German army invaded Austria in 1938 and Czechoslovakia in 1939, and the Poles, who gained independence after World War I, were understandably afraid of Nazi aggression. Stalin calculated that the point must come when both the British and the French would tire of Hitler's conquests, and after the war, the Soviet Union would be able to expand its influence throughout the shattered continent. It was extremely tense in the summer of 1939, with the air practically filled with gunpowder. Consequently, Stalin ordered military mobilization and the increase of production. However, in the delivery room of opportunistic diplomacy, the Communist Soviets and the Nazis, the two arch-enemies, came to an agreement. The Soviets were primarily motivated by the rejection of Western countries, while the Germans wanted to avoid fighting on two fronts and secure the Romanian oil fields. In August 1939, this agreement manifested in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and its secret clause. It was a non-aggression pact between the two empires, but the secret clause also outlined the territorial division of Eastern Europe. There was no turning back. On September 1, 1939, the Wehrmacht, supported by the dreaded SS, crossed the Polish border, marking the beginning of the most destructive war in history. For those interested in learning more about how Europe came to this point, I recommend A.J.P. Taylor's book, The Origins of the Second World War. The British and the French swiftly declared war on Nazi Germany, and the Red Army occupied the promised eastern Polish areas on September 17th. Meanwhile, Stalin was also tempted to conquer Finland, which had previously belonged to Tsarist Russia. As a result, the Soviet Union attacked its northwestern neighbor on November 30, 1939. Despite the apparent Soviet superiority, the Finns heroically fought in the snow-covered landscape, defeating them in the Winter War. This humiliating outcome compelled Stalin to make peace and accept the much smaller ceded territories. The Soviets lost at least 130,000 soldiers during the 3.5 months of the conflict, while 26,000 Finnish troops were killed or went missing. On June 14, 1940, the Germans marched into Paris, which once again surprised the world, including Stalin. In September, after the Axis powers signed the Tripartite Pact, the General Secretary suggested they should join the alliance as a precaution to avoid conflict with the formidable Nazi force. However, after seeing the Red Army's weakness in Finland, Hitler convinced himself he could take Moscow. Thus, on June 22, 1941, the Führer launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, spearheaded by 3 million soldiers. It was the largest land offensive in the history of mankind, and the Germans planned it to be a blitzkrieg as well. Regarding Operation Barbarossa, it is important to note that Stalin was not surprised by the German attack. He simply did not believe they would dare to act while still at war with Britain. In addition to his own intelligence, he also received information from foreign sources, indicating that the Germans were already making preparations and moving towards the east. So it is not true that they were caught off guard, especially considering that an estimated 8 million people in the Soviet Union, including soldiers, nurses, truck drivers, and everyone, were either preparing or mobilized in connection with military operations at the time. The issue was that when the Nazis crossed the border, many of these individuals were in transit on trains or other vehicles amid mobilizations and redeployments, rather than in combat positions. Stalin also issued an order to prevent mobilization along the German-Soviet border to avoid provoking the Nazis. One of the most famous images of the dictator was captured on June 22, 1941, when he received the news in the Kremlin at 4:31 a.m. that the Third Reich had attacked the Soviet Union. This photo was allegedly taken by the editor-in-chief of the party newspaper, Komsomolskaya Pravda, and despite being ordered to destroy it, he stored it instead. Whether this is true or not, what matters is that such a picture of the dictator has been released. The dictator, who reacted very slowly to the invasion in the first few hours. He thought that only a few reckless German generals were operating without Hitler's knowledge. Worth mentioning that there is another version of the picture's origin claiming it was taken sometime after September 16, 1941, when Stalin was informed that the Germans had surrounded Kiev. Historians do not agree on whether Stalin planned to launch an attack in the summer of 1941. Some argue that the General Secretary did not believe his army was prepared enough to battle the Nazis, but considered the clash inevitable. Others claim that the Soviets were planning an invasion, citing the military maps given to the Red Army units. They were given maps of the territories previously occupied by the Germans and of the Third Reich itself, but received almost no material of the Soviet territories. Such maps can be used by military units only in the planned deployment area, indicating that they intended to attack but were unprepared for defense. The German advance thus brought unprecedented success. By July, they were approaching Moscow, and in September they bombed Leningrad, while they had already seized Ukraine and Belarus. Stalin refused to leave the capital because he believed his departure would demoralize the army. He also ordered the retreating armies to implement the scorched earth policy, which meant they were to destroy all the infrastructure, crops, and livestock so that the Germans could not use them for military purposes. He enforced strict discipline within the forces, leading to the execution of many political prisoners, the labeling of captured troops as traitors, and the imposition of the death penalty. You have probably seen movie scenes depicting situations from Stalingrad to Leningrad, in which political commissars shot those who fled the devastating fire of the German MG-42s. These atrocities occurred as a result of Order No. 227, issued by Stalin on July 28, 1942, and became known by the motto, "Not one step backwards." It also created penal battalions at the fronts, initially consisting of soldiers and officers deemed problematic. They were dispatched to the most dangerous deployments, practically to certain death. By the end of the war, around 420,000 individuals had been assigned to these battalions. Other squads were positioned behind the main forces to prevent escape, although commanders did not implement this strategy everywhere because they saw it as a waste of resources. The Germans also established such units for convicts and deserters. Sven Hassel, a Danish best-selling author, wrote a series of novels about a penal panzer regiment's experiences during World War II. He published 14 books in total, the first of which is The Legion of the Damned, which I highly recommend. The Moscow offensive slowed down after a few months, so the Germans turned their attention to the Caspian Sea for the precious oil. In Stalingrad, however, the population showed incredible resistance, even though the enemy had occupied 90% of the city. Despite 1 million dead and 600,000 wounded, they eventually triumphed and surrounded the Wehrmacht. This was Hitler's first major defeat, shattering his myth of invincibility. A few weeks after the start of Operation Barbarossa, on July 12, 1941, the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom signed an agreement to fight against the Germans, and then the United States entered the war as well on December 7th, following the Japanese air attack on Pearl Harbor. The war had many pivotal moments in the coming years. We can recall D-Day, the Allied landings in Sicily, the tank battle at Kursk, or the Japanese losing the Pacific Ocean, but the United States' entry was the most decisive. Stalin's personal image benefited greatly from the Anglo-Saxon alliance. In 1942, Time magazine named him Man of the Year for the second time, a title he had already earned in 1939. People called him Uncle Joe, but he wasn't too happy about it. Interestingly, he was nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize, once in 1945 and again in 1948. However, except for 1939, all these covers and nominations were based on the fact that they fought against a common enemy, and his crimes have yet to come to light in their entirety. We know the end of the war. The Nazis gradually pushed back from the conquered regions until the Red Army occupied Berlin, and Hitler reportedly committed suicide. He was terrified that if the Soviets caught him alive, Stalin would parade him across Red Square in a cage like a trophy animal. But his death would be the topic of another documentary. As soon as Stalin was first touched by the breeze of victory, his primary goal was to spread communist influence over as large an area as possible, which he communicated both covertly and openly to the leaders of the Allies, Churchill, Roosevelt, then Attlee and Truman. The Germans laid down their arms in May 1945, and the General Secretary turned eastward to the still warring Japan. The Far East Empire's final surrender came only after 2 American atomic bombs. They were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9. But the Japanese capitulation also required Stalin to send 500,000 soldiers to the east, and on August 9th, they launched the invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. The Red Army, which swelled to 1.5 million, defeated the fearsome Kwantung Army. He even wanted to participate in the post-war settlement of Japan, but the Americans, who had just become the only nuclear power, did not entertain the idea. One of the saddest historical realities, which I must mention, is that conquering armies frequently rape the women of the conquered territories in large numbers, regardless of their age. Unfortunately, there was no difference this time either. The Soviet army routinely plundered homes and destroyed the lives of millions of women wherever they went, as did the Nazis and other armies. For instance, in Hungary, one of the Soviet-occupied nations, it is believed that Red Army soldiers sexually assaulted approximately 500,000 women, many of whom became pregnant. In Budapest alone, the number of Hungarian women raped during and after their campaign is estimated between 50,000 and 200,000. This is an extremely hard-to-digest chapter of 20th century history, and in Hungary, it was largely concealed because of the subsequent 40-year Soviet occupation. Even Matyas Rákosi, the Stalinist de facto dictator of Hungary between 1949 and 1956, complained that the cruelty of the Soviet soldiers worsened the perception of Hungarian communists. Only a few families in the Central European country have not been affected by this horror. There were countless stories, but the now great-grandmothers, grandmothers, and grandfathers kept them to themselves. The conquerors viewed women quite simply as the prize of war, and propaganda and the attitude of the military leadership contributed significantly to the brutality. Stalin, who was merciless under all circumstances, wouldn't want to take action against the atrocities. Instead, he even refused to punish the soldiers of the Red Army. But there is another story to tell about his ruthless nature, starting with the mistreatment of his firstborn son, Yakov. In 1928, the then 21-year-old man wanted to marry a 16-year-old girl, but Stalin strongly opposed it, so Yakov attempted suicide by shooting himself. However, the bullet missed his heart, and he was able to recuperate after several months in the hospital. Upon hearing the news, his father allegedly said that, quote, "He can't even shoot straight." Furthermore, in 1941, he allowed and even encouraged Yakov and his adopted son, Artyom Sergeyev, to enlist in the military. The latter was the son of an old friend of Stalin's, Fyodor Sergeyev, who died in a train accident in 1921, after which Lenin suggested that Stalin should adopt the infant. In the Battle of Smolensk on July 16, 1942, the Nazis captured Yakov and held him in multiple camps. When General Paulus surrendered in the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943, the Germans offered Yakov in exchange, but Stalin refused. He felt that if he accepted the offer, he would no longer be Stalin, as other party members also had thousands of sons in German POW camps, and he reportedly said, "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant." Yakov died on April 14, 1943. The Germans claimed that an electric fence in Sachsenhausen killed him, but there were rumors that actually a guard had shot him. The adopted son fought throughout the war and stayed in the army afterward. In the following years, he rose to the rank of brigadier general and died in 2008. The international political palette was drastically transformed after the war. The British and the French lost their historical diplomatic roles. The Westphalian system was already a thing of the past, and in the decades that followed, the colonies gained their independence. Regarding the sliced German state, the victors tried to prevent them from once again becoming a military superpower like the Third Reich. East Central Europe fell under the Soviet Union's sphere of interest, and the Russian Bear prevented numerous heroic attempts for democratization during the Cold War. Because of the local communists and the occupying Red Army, there was never a chance to establish a Western-style parliamentary democracy in these countries. From the ashes of the world's most destructive war, the United States emerged first as a nuclear superpower, followed by the Soviet Union in 1949, when they successfully built their own atomic bombs. The coming decades were spent in the ever-ominous atmosphere of the Cold War, framed by the two empires' arms race and proxy wars. Despite the Soviets nearly losing the war that demanded enormous human sacrifices, Stalin tried to take advantage of the victorious domestic public mood. He had earlier appointed himself a marshal, but once Germany surrendered, he also assumed the rank of generalissimus. His personal cult grew even stronger as people carried his portraits around the occupied countries and hung them in their homes and offices. He was celebrated to such an extent, he was practically placed above Lenin himself. He allowed this despite making many disastrous military decisions, and it wasn't he who won the war on the front lines. The 6-year conflict destroyed 1,700 Soviet towns and 70,000 villages, along with around 32,000 factories and 65,000 kilometers of railway track. Before, during, and after the war, famine ran rampant, and intimidation was ubiquitous. 27 million is only the estimated number of the dead. Millions more were injured, widowed, or orphaned. His never-ending suspicion of the enemy circling around him did not go away. Even before the German invasion, he initiated a purge among the military, resulting in the deaths of thousands of officers, thus weakening the army. But he also didn't leave the returning soldiers alone. He sent 2.8 million of them to a kind of screening camp to be interrogated to see whether they were traitors, and then about half of them were transported to labor camps. He further escalated the terror by expanding the Gulag system and expelling kulaks from the freshly seized territories, which again led to the deportation of millions to the east. Soviet soldiers randomly grabbed innocent people walking down the street in Eastern Europe and dragged them thousands of miles away from their homes. In parallel, these states were also undergoing a complete political transformation. Regarding the Gulags, it's worth mentioning that Svetlana, already a young lady, had difficulty finding a partner because there are fathers who are protective within reasonable limits, and there was Stalin. His daughter's love was Alexei Kapler, a Ukrainian Jewish film director 23 years older than Svetlana. In 1943, however, Stalin's court sentenced him to 5 years in the terrifying Vorkutlag, and again for another 5 years in 1948. Nonetheless, in 1944, Svetlana married a Moscow University student named Grigory Morozov, also Jewish, and the couple had a child named Joseph. Although they divorced in 1947, they remained close in the following decades. Regarding grandfather Stalin, he disliked the man even though they never met. 1945 was not only about the triumphant war. The dictator, who was nearly 67 at the time, experienced heart problems, forcing him to take a 2-month rest. It was well known that the general secretary tried to avoid all forms of physical exercise. He refused even short walks, and almost completely stopped hunting, which he had learned out of necessity during his exile. His only sports-related activities were chess and billiards, for which many tables were placed in his houses. Furthermore, he was also a heavy smoker, and the thought of the German army and SS divisions shelling a few miles from him surely didn't help him quit. He smoked pipes the most, having dozens of them, some of which he received for his 70th birthday. He usually filled them with Prince Albert, Edgeworth, or Herzegovina floor tobacco. During these years, he appeared to become increasingly paranoid and made several changes in the top management, fearing that something might be planned against him. The most significant move of this restructuring was the marginalization of Vyacheslav Molotov, his old comrade and wartime foreign minister. He began to favor new people as well. For example, in March 1946, Georgy Malenkov, who later became his successor, became a member of the political committee. Lavrenti Beria, People's Commissar for Internal Affairs and NKVD leader since 1938, was appointed Deputy Prime Minister and full member of the Politburo in 1946. And in 1949, Nikita Khrushchev returned from Ukraine to Moscow, which he dedicated to Stalin as a birthday present. By the early 1950s, Stalin, Malenkov, Beria, and Khrushchev were the four most powerful figures in the Soviet Union. Of course, no one dared to question the dictator's authority, but no one trusted him either. Everyone dreaded him for his unpredictability. Another famous episode of his constant creation of enemies was the series of conceptual trials in the late 1940s and early 1950s, known as the Leningrad case, or the Leningrad Affair, in which Leningrad party leaders were accused of treason for organizing a simple trade fair to boost the post-war economy and support the survivors. The death penalty was abolished in the country in 1947, but it was reinstated on January 12, 1950, and on October 1st, 6 prominent defendants, including Mikhail Rodionov, the chairman of the Council of Ministers, or Prime Minister, were executed. 200 officials were imprisoned for at least 10 years, and another 2,000 people were expelled from the city. The true reason for the purge was that the dictator feared competition from the younger and more popular Leningrad leaders, who had been hailed as heroes following the city's World War II siege. Malenkov and Beria were the masterminds behind the whole showdown. The sole purpose was to demonstrate that, outside of Moscow and the Kremlin, there could be no other power centers in the country, not even in the former Tsarist capital. As Stalin's health worsened, he gave only 3 public speeches after 1946, 2 of which lasted only a few minutes. At the 19th Party Congress, on October 5, 1952, for instance, he spoke for 5 minutes, and that was his last speech in front of cameras. By the way, he weighed 143 pounds and was 5 feet 5 inches tall, so he wore special shoes and often stood on platforms. In 1949, he suffered a stroke, after which his written work began to decline. He took longer and longer breaks in the early 1950s, retiring to one of his dachas. The dachas are residential summer homes in the suburbs or countryside. The tyrant had several of them, including 5 in Moscow, 5 in Abkhazia, and 3 in other regions. In 1950 and 1951, for example, he spent 5 months in his Misra dacha on the Black Sea coast. He really loved nature. After the First World War in the 1920s, he regularly traveled to the Black Sea with his entourage. One of his travel partners later remarked that the atmosphere was completely different on those occasions. Stalin and everyone were happy, simply telling stories and singing by the water and among the trees. Another intriguing fact is that Stalin detested cooking and could not tolerate the act itself, so his rooms were always located as far away from the kitchen as possible. Sometimes his staff even brought him food from a restaurant. During his exile in Siberia with Sverdlov, he was only willing to participate in hunting and fishing, but refused to help with food preparation. We can imagine how much he enjoyed washing the dishes. Either someone else did it for him, or he allowed the dogs to lick his plate on the floor. Since we delved into his eating habits, he allegedly enjoyed lying in a bathtub full of pickled gherkins. He ate quite modestly and with less variety. His favorite dishes were meat soup with sauerkraut in the winter, cabbage soup in the summer, and a slice of beef with butter and buckwheat for a second course. Typically, the staff served cranberry jelly or dried fruit compote for dessert. During his meals, the focus was always on meat, which he preferred overcooked. With his health deteriorating, His suspicion of the doctors around him grew, a shadowy chapter of his reign I will discuss in more detail soon. Perhaps he felt that he had entered the last stage of his life, and thus began to organize his legacy. For instance, he reformed the political committee and published his final book in 1952, intended to guide his successors. He increased the number of Politburo members in addition to himself from 8 to 25, and all signs indicated that he wanted to get rid of the senior comrades, whom he considered old, and wanted an update on the leadership. Since his health declined, his body doubles became more occupied. One of them was a man named Felix Dadaev, who was chosen by Stalin himself and who, in his old age, said in an interview that he sometimes went to the theater instead of Stalin so that people could see him. The dictator's favorite performance was Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, which he tried to attend as frequently as possible. In the early 1950s, rumors about the communist leader's death began to circulate in the West, prompting the constant dispatch of his doubles for public appearances. Dadaev, for example, was the general secretary's replacement during parades in addition to theaters. So Stalin was becoming increasingly ill and saw a dark future ahead. It appeared that he was making preparations to ensure that his vision would persist even after his death. However, it seems that many of the most powerful politicians of the period were not part of his plans. Given their knowledge of Stalin, they may have pondered what fate he had planned for them. And this is how we arrive at the day when Joseph Stalin, master of life and death, died under mysterious circumstances in one of his dachas after being visited by Politburo members who were getting increasingly concerned about their positions. We are in Kuntsevo, a western district of Moscow, where Stalin's personal residence is located. He spent the last 2 decades of his life in this completely green palace, known as the Kuntsevo Dacha. The construction of the 1,010 square meter 2-story building began in 1934 based on Miron Merzhanov's plans. The complex stands on a 26-hectare plot and was known by several names, including Kuntsevo Dacha and Blizhnaya Dacha, which translates as Nearer Dacha in English. Shockingly, it was called Nearer Dacha because it was near the Kremlin, and because the dictator had far dachas in farther parts of the country. The building was of course not visible from the road, as it was surrounded by a 5-meter-tall double perimeter fence, a 70,000-tree birch forest, one of the symbols of Russian art, and many maples, Stalin's favorite, were also planted. His love for nature led him to cultivate his own small garden with apple and lemon trees, a pond, a rose garden, and occasionally watermelons. The defenses included 8 camouflage 30mm anti-aircraft guns and 300 security personnel working in shifts. They belonged to the NKVD's successor, the Ministry of State Security, known as the MGB, which became the infamous KGB in 1954, but not directly. Only the most important guests were permitted to drive in. All others had to leave their vehicles at the main gate and walk in. Stalin preferred working on the terraces, as well as in the small dining room on the ground floor to the left of the main entrance, and he often fell asleep on one of the sofas there. He also had a normal office, although it was in Object 18, a 17-meter deep bunker built between 1940 and 1942. On the ground floor, there were 7 rooms, including a rather puritanical bathroom and bedroom. The dacha was also rebuilt and expanded several times to suit his needs. For example, the salon was erected when he hosted Mao Zedong, founder of the People's Republic of China, and his entourage in Kuntsevo. The 74-year-old general secretary's favorite was the small dining room that had a radio given to him by Winston Churchill, a fireplace, and beautiful Turkmen and Persian carpets. Churchill visited him in August 1942 and Mao in December 1949, bringing Chinese embroidery and glasswork as gifts. On December 16th, Mao came to Moscow to celebrate Stalin's birthday. The most absurd scene of the event occurred when a 12-year-old girl named Natalia delivered a poem praising Stalin's glories just a few meters away from the communist leaders. Little Natalia was the daughter of Alexander Poskrebyshev, a longtime party member who had worked with Stalin since 1924. He was the former chief of the secret section of the Central Committee and the dictator's personal secretary. However, his wife, Natalia's mother, Bronislava, was arrested in 1939. Lavrenti Beria, with Stalin's knowledge, accused the woman of counter-revolutionary liaisons with Leon Trotsky, and she was shot in a mass grave near Moscow on October 13, 1941. So this is how the little girl had to recite a poem, but there is a twist regarding his birthday. Stalin was born on December 18, 1878, although only according to the Gregorian calendar, as the Russians only switched from the Julian calendar in 1918. But the math wouldn't work out that way either, because according to the Julian calendar, his birthday was December 6, 1878. However, Stalin, like many things in his past, altered this too, and his official biography listed December 21, 1879 as his birthday. That's why he celebrated his 70th birthday in 1949. But why December 21st was chosen is a mystery, though the educated and atheist Stalin, who built his cult at a breakneck speed, must have been aware of how the winter solstice, the longest night, and the return of the sun are important in ancient religions. For instance, the birth of Jesus was also adjusted to this day. Of course, the dictator spent much time in the Kremlin, where he had his office and living quarters, but Kuntsevo eventually became his headquarters. He lived there, held exclusive meetings, and made the most important political decisions. To the left of the entrance, Stalin's main study, the small dining room, opened from the lobby. A door opened into the salon, or large dining room, and to the right, a narrow and long corridor led to the other rooms. He rarely ascended to the upper story, added in 1943, and did it exclusively via elevator. His children had rooms there, but they barely visited the residence. Svetlana, for example, only spent a few days there a year. The events that led up to the fateful night began in 1952, when Stalin complained of high blood pressure, dizziness, and nausea, and his personal doctor, Vladimir Vinogradov, suggested on January 19th that he should resign from his position for health reasons, as he may have cerebral atherosclerosis in the background. We can imagine the dictator's reaction. Vinogradov was arrested in November, and soon after he was put on trial in the infamous doctor's plot. In the next period, he was examined by a doctor only in April due to a severe cold, but apart from that, there is no evidence that he was under the care of any physician. He reluctantly stopped smoking that year, but received no medical treatment other than a few drops of iodine poured into a glass of water to alleviate his hypertension. The doctor's plot was a series of show trials that began in 1951, accusing primarily Jewish doctors of attempting to murder high-ranking officials. The Pravda referred to them as killer doctors, and propaganda spread that they worked for American and British intelligence. However, it is worth providing some context to the procedure because it did not come out of nowhere. It was well known that Stalin did not trust doctors, did not like Jews, and especially the Zionist movement. Historians could also uncover what he might have been up to shortly before his death. At the time, approximately 2 million Jews lived in the Soviet Union. A significant number of them were also Holocaust survivors, and the General Secretary decided to deport them all to the Jewish Autonomous Oblast in the Far East. Stalin created this administrative territory bordering China in 1928. Its capital is Birobidzhan, today a town of 75,000, originally established in 1915 as a stop on the Trans-Siberian Railway. The intention was to relocate a large number of Jews, and by the end of the 1940s, already 50,000 of them lived there. But the area was extremely harsh. There were mountains, forests, and swamps in some places, and the weather was quite unfriendly. As a result, many deportees left the region over time and settled either in the United States or other more livable countries. Stalin allegedly wanted to deport all 2 million Jews, but by 1952, his plans included the Gulags too. He orchestrated the entire process so that the primarily Jewish doctors would be condemned in public show trials, alleging they had previously caused the deaths of several prominent Soviet politicians and managed to keep their acts secret. The entire deportation operation would have started with the public execution of the doctors, and to avoid the deceived Soviet people's probable outrage and mass lynchings, the Jews would have been transported to the camps east of the Urals. The construction of 4 larger gulags in the southern and western parts of Siberia shortly before Stalin's death was most likely not a coincidence. According to several sources, the dictator intended to begin deportations as early as February 1953, but the large population caused the census of Jews to proceed slowly. It was also mentioned as part of the plan that after everyone had been deported to the Far East, Stalin would have been hailed as a hero for preventing the people from attacking the Jews. Fortunately, the deportations did not begin, and many attribute this only to Stalin's sudden death. But it is also important to point out that, according to Russian historian Zores Medvedev, no official document supports Stalin's conspiracy. It's only based on later statements and indirect circumstances. Stalin's doctor, Vladimir Vinogradov, was among the 12 Kremlin doctors imprisoned on January 13, 1953. The Pravda, which was both a newspaper and the Communist Party's mouthpiece, presented him as an agent of British intelligence and was published with the title, "Terrorist Doctors Exposed." Those arrested were tortured in the gruesome Lubyanka prison, where they eventually confessed to everything they were told. These events once again incited concern in the top management, as they feared that the always unpredictable Stalin could once again embark on a massive purge, and the doctor's plot and the reorganization of the political committee were only precursors to that. And so came the night of February 28, 1953, when Stalin began discussing with Beria in Kuntsevo how the doctor's plot was going. Thanks to the recollections of the staff and the politicians who were present, as well as the declassified testimonies of the guards, the events of that evening have since been revealed. Stalin usually traveled to Kuntsevo in a large convoy, accompanied by numerous policemen and several identical cars, making it practically impossible to identify which one he was in. They always had to take a different route to reach the dacha, with these routes determined at the last minute. This innovation is attributed to him in the Soviet Union after he scolded the security personnel for always going the same way, thus making it easier for potential assassins. That evening, the inner circle started in the Kremlin and watched a film together in Stalin's screening room, where he always sat in the front row. He enjoyed Grigory Alexandrov's 1934 film Jolly Fellows, and particularly liked John Wayne westerns and classic James Cagney gangster stories, but his favorite was John Ford's 1934 movie, The Lost Patrol. After they finished, they all moved to Kuntsevo. The guests, most often high-ranking politicians, arrived in black limousines and parked in front of the Green Palace. They were only allowed to leave if Stalin dismissed them. Otherwise, they had to stay for as long as necessary. Then the boss escorted them out, and the guards closed the door behind them. The evening of February 28th and the early hours of March 1st, 1953, were spent in a particularly nostalgic atmosphere. February 28th was Saturday, and the entire leadership was present, including Malenkov, Beria, Khrushchev, and Bulganin, whom the General Secretary sometimes called his surrogate family, or Piaturka in Russian, which means the Five. They were in the salon during the evening, and Stalin drank only diluted Georgian wine, not cognac and other stronger drinks, to avoid their side effects. Regarding his alcohol consumption habits, he mostly just sipped his wines, but he often forced his guests to drink heavily. During those days, he was particularly paranoid because he was worried that someone might try to poison him. This fear was exacerbated by his practice of never drinking from the drinks poured for him, instead always exchanging glasses with someone. His favorite was the Georgian wine Kavanchkara, and he had a special person to test his food, a childhood friend named Alexander Ignatashvili, whom he dubbed Rabbit, and who, according to some reports, could be his half-brother. Throughout the evening, they talked a lot about Yugoslavia, Tito, and the ongoing Korean War. His guests extolled the glories of the past, but the old dictator was unimpressed and indifferent. He even mocked them at one point, calling them defenseless kittens who would have been crushed by imperialism long ago without him. He was irritable and in a bad mood that evening, and was quite sarcastic with his guests. However, Khrushchev's son Sergei claimed years later, based on his father, that Stalin joked with his old man a few times and did not appear ill. His sense of humor was a bit childish sometimes. Once he allegedly placed a tomato on the chair of one of the Politburo members, then burst out laughing when he sat in it. At one point during the evening, he asked Beria about the doctor's plot. Stalin was particularly interested in how his physician's case was going, to which Beria responded, "Apart from his other unfavorable qualities, the professor has a long tongue. He has told one of the doctors in his clinic that Comrade Stalin has already had several dangerous hypertonic episodes." As I mentioned, Professor Vinogradov was jailed because he dared to suggest to Stalin that he should step down from power due to weeks of nausea and high blood pressure. But what would have been the best solution on his part? As we can see, saying what he believed would be beneficial to his health resulted in his arrest and torturous interrogation. However, if he had not shared his medical advice, his decision to remain silent about the potential solution could also have resulted in imprisonment and subsequent allegations of conspiracy. In this regard, it is worth mentioning the mysterious circumstances surrounding the death of renowned neurologist Vladimir Bekhterev. Bekhterev worked parallelly with the world-famous Ivan Pavlov as they competed in the study of conditioned reflexes, and he was also one of the co-founders of the first All-Russian Congress of Neurologists in Psychiatry. On December 23, 1927, the 70-year-old scientist lectured on child neurology, after which he was summoned to the Kremlin to examine Stalin's arm. About 3 hours later, he returned to the Congress, where he allegedly told some of his colleagues, "I have just examined a paranoiac with a short, dry hand." So he dared to diagnose the country's leader with paranoia while examining his arm, and then mocked him in front of others. Bekhterev may not have been familiar with the story of Stalin dancing with wolves in the Siberian night, and the latter probably knew history better than average due to his education. For example, at least 4 Roman emperors were killed by their guards, and the same was true of Alexander the Great's father. Furthermore, Stalin could probably recall that the Bolsheviks executed Tsar Nicholas II. His grandfather, Tsar Alexander II, was blown up by far-left terrorists. And much earlier, in 1801, Tsar Paul I, the son of Catherine the Great, was assassinated by conspirators in his bedroom, so his fears were not completely unfounded. The neurologist, who was in good health for his age, died the day after his words. Some speculated he was poisoned, but his name was surely removed from the scientific books. Another doctor, Dr. Pletnev, experienced something similar. He examined Stalin in 1937, after which he diagnosed him with megalomania and a persecution complex. He was arrested not long after, and in 1941 he was executed by a firing squad. Stalin is credited with many well-known quotes, such as, "The death of one man is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic. You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs," or "Elections are not decided by those who vote, but by those who count the votes." However, we need to clarify a few things here. Regarding the first quote, there is no historical evidence that Stalin said that. It was mainly attributed to him in the Anglo-Saxon literature. Winston Churchill's daughter, Mary, claimed to have heard a variation of the quote from Stalin near the end of World War II. According to Soviet historian Anton Antonov Ovsienko, Stalin may have said something similar to Churchill at the Tehran Conference after learning that the British Prime Minister wouldn't support another French front. The first such line can be found in Kurt Tucholsky's French joke from 1925, in which he wrote, "The war, I can't find it so terrible. The death of one man, that is a catastrophe. 100,000 deaths, that is a statistic." The omelet quote comes from François de Charette, a French lieutenant general who participated in the American Revolutionary War and was one of the leaders of the war in the Vendée. He made a similar statement in 1743, and in 1933, the New York Times journalist Walter Duranty linked it to Stalin. However, he didn't use it as a direct quote. Instead, he wanted to convey the ruthlessness of the Soviet leaders in the nationalizations. Regarding the counting of votes, Boris Bajanov, Stalin's former secretary, wrote in his book The Memoirs of Stalin's Former Secretary that his boss had said the following in 1923: "I consider it completely unimportant who in the party will vote or how. But what is extraordinarily important is this: who will count the votes and how." Stalin also emphasized the importance of propaganda at the 12th Congress of the Communist Party on April 19, 1923, saying, "The press must grow day in and day out. It is our party's sharpest and most powerful weapon." After Beria revealed that Vinogradov liked to talk, another famous Stalin line was uttered. "Right. What do you propose to do now? Have the doctors confessed? Tell Ignatiev that if he doesn't get full confessions out of them, we'll reduce his height by a head." Semyon Ignatiev was the Minister of State Security, and Beria assured Stalin that the doctors would confess, after which a public trial would be held with his approval. Stalin ordered to arrange it, and then they discussed other topics until 4 a.m. At 4 a.m., he got up and escorted his guests out, then went to sleep. Malenkov and Beria left together in the same car, while the others left separately. The dacha became silent, and there was one very important rule: the staff could only enter Stalin's room if they were called. The in-house guards that night were Ivan Vasilievich Krustalev, Mikhail Grigorovich Starostin, and a certain V. Tukov. Pavel Lozgachev replaced Orlov as dacha commander that day, and Matriona Butusova, the housekeeper, was also present. So at 4 a.m., he went to sleep, and the unusual events had begun. According to Starostin, Stalin gave the following order: "I'm going to bed. I shouldn't be wanting you. You can go to bed too." As a result, his guards went to rest, even though the dictator had never given such an order before. Tukov later confirmed this statement in an interview with journalist Edward Radzinski in 1997, except that it was Krustalev, one of the guards that night, who gave the order, rather than the boss personally. Time passed, but Stalin did not come out of his suite during the forenoon, and the staff began to panic. The dacha personnel always started gathering in the kitchen at 10 a.m. to plan the day, as the dictator usually got up between 11 and 12. While sleeping, his calls were redirected to another room, therefore ringing his phone would not wake him. The protocol was that once he was awake and ready, he rang the bell for the guards, whose room was connected to his by a 25-meter corridor. The crew waited all afternoon for the boss to show signs of life, but they didn't dare to go in, because it could have easily cost them their jobs, freedom, or even their lives. By 7:30 p.m., nothing had happened, but then a guard telephoned from the yard that he had seen a light switched on in Stalin's room. Everyone calmed down a little, but his behavior was still unusual because he hadn't eaten anything all day and didn't read his messages and the daily newspapers. Starostin and Tukov later admitted to their superior, former NKVD officer turned Stalin's bodyguard Alexei Rybin, who was not at the dacha that night, that at around 7 p.m., they were increasingly alarmed but too afraid to go inside. Finally, Lozgachev entered the dictator's room sometime between 10 and 11 p.m. because a package from the Central Committee had arrived, and it was his duty to hand it over. Before knocking, employees normally made a lot of noise so that no one would catch Stalin off guard. Lozgachev did the same, and he stated in a later interview that he was terrified to death. According to him, Stalin, one of the most powerful people in the world, hated when someone wanted to go in quietly. He liked it when someone showed up confidently and didn't bother him for long. Next to the small dining room was the room where the mails were put. When Starostin got there, he could peer in the direction of the light, and then he saw Stalin sprawled on the floor, next to the table. The soldier approached Stalin in complete shock and noticed he was somewhat conscious. He couldn't speak but tried to pull something up next to his body with his left hand. His right hand was stretched out from his body, and he was drenched in urine. On the floor next to him, the guard found a Pravda issue, a pocket watch that stopped at 6:30, and there was a bottle of Narzan mineral water on the table. Lozgachev believes the dictator probably went for the water when the light was switched on. Then, after a sudden snore, he fell asleep, prompting the guard to summon Starostin via the intercom. Tukov and Butusova followed him. They laid Stalin on the sofa and alerted everyone. They first called their superior, Ignatiev, the Minister of State Security, who panicked and told them to try Beria and Malenkov, who had left the dacha together. Meanwhile, they moved Stalin to the larger sofa in the salon, where the air was better. But the general secretary started to shiver from the cold. They covered him with a blanket, and Butusova unrolled his sleeves. First, they reached Malenkov, Stalin's deputy, who called back half an hour later, saying he couldn't find Beria. After another 30 minutes, the latter called and ordered them not to tell anyone about Comrade Stalin's illness. Malenkov and Beria arrived at around 3 a.m. in the same limousine they left the day before, 4 hours after the first phone calls, which was especially strange given that the Politburo members all resided nearby, about 15 minutes from Kuntsevo. According to Lozgachev's account, Malenkov even took off his squeaky boots and stuck them under his arm to avoid making any noise near Stalin, while Beria allegedly said, quote, "What are you panicking for? The boss is sound asleep. Let's go, Malenkov." The guard then explained to Beria how he had found the master and how worrying it was, but Beria repeated himself. "Don't panic and don't bother us, and don't disturb Comrade Stalin." It should be noted that the general secretary was really just snoring at this point. On the other hand, from Stalin's perspective, the guards had entered his room without permission, and Beria and the others had also gone to Kuntsevo without permission, only to find the once powerful dictator helpless and lying in his own urine. Given Stalin's reputation, these would have easily resulted in death sentences. Of course, only if Stalin regains consciousness and is healthy, because no one could witness him in such a state. They left him for hours again after that, but by then he could have collapsed for a day. Khrushchev arrived at 7 a.m., and he was also brought up to speed. He said that the doctors were already on their way, and they arrived just after 8:30, led by Professors Lukomsky and Myasnikov. The situation was quite embarrassing, and this is why I explained the doctor's plot earlier, because not only Stalin's personal doctor, but also the best physicians of Moscow were arrested, making it much more difficult to find fitting specialists. According to those present, Ignatiev did not dare enter the room, and the doctors trembled with fear. Their hands were constantly shaking as they examined Stalin. At one point, the dentist dropped his plates and even the dictator's dentures. When they arrived on March 2nd, Stalin was again soaked in his urine. His right arm and leg were paralyzed, and they observed the so-called Babinski reflex. This is an abnormal plantar reflex, which the doctor can trigger by dragging a pointed object along the outer edge of the sole, moving from the heel to the little toe, and then turning towards the big toe. Normally, all the toes reflexively bend towards the sole, but in abnormal cases, the big toe stretches upwards while the other toes spread like a fan. The latter refers to damage in the brain or spinal cord. After removing his shirt, they also measured his blood pressure, which was 190/110 with a pulse of 78. To ease this, they put 8 leeches behind his ears, and cold compress and hypertonic enemas of magnesium sulfate were administered. They tried everything. They even removed his false teeth. However, at 2:10 p.m., they noticed the so-called Cheney-Stokes respiration, a common symptom of respiratory failure and heart failure. As a result, his blood pressure rose to 210/120. He was again given leeches and injections of magnesium sulfate, but his condition continued to deteriorate in the following days. An MGB agent started calling the imprisoned doctors to see if they knew someone who could treat this breathing disorder, but he was told that anyone who knew how had either died or been jailed. Following the examinations, the doctors ordered complete silence and concluded that Joseph Stalin had suffered a stroke. There was not much to do. They let the dictator rest. His daughter Svetlana visited him on March 2nd, and his son Vasily arrived drunk, and the power struggle had already begun in the background. The mostly unresponsive boss was of course visited by the leadership, but there was little chance of recovering. Beria, Malenkov, and Khrushchev all paid visits, as did Molotov, Mikoyan, Voroshilov, and Kaganovich, who had all fallen out of favor by then and may have felt slight relief by the events. Dr. Myasnikov later recalled that Stalin could only groan sometimes, but there was a point on March 3rd when his conscious gaze seemed to go around the faces by the bed. Voroshilov was also there and told the boss with great enthusiasm, "Comrade Stalin, we, all your true friends and colleagues, are here. How are you feeling, dear friend?" But his eyes were devoid of expression already. Myashnikov also said they could observe the unfolding race between the politicians in the new power vacuum. Malenkov and Beria were always the first to enter Stalin's room, with Voroshilov, Kaganovich, Bulganin, and Mikoyan following. Khrushchev also visited him, but on March 5th, for instance, he just watched from the door as Stalin received his injections throughout the day. Molotov also wasn't feeling well, but still came to see him 2 or 3 times. He recounted that once when he was out in Kuntsevo, Stalin's eyes were closed, but when he opened them for a second and tried to speak, Beria came in running and kissed Stalin's hands. On March 4th, the Pravda announced the leader was sick and suffered a stroke in his dacha. On the same day, he began to hiccup uncontrollably and vomited blood twice. On March 5th, he began to sweat profusely, and his pulse was undetectable. He did not respond to oxygen, nor to camphor and adrenaline injections. This is how Svetlana remembered the last moments. Father's death was slow and difficult. His face became dark and different. His features were becoming unrecognizable. The death agony was terrible. It choked him slowly as we watched. At the last moment, he suddenly opened his eyes. It was a horrible look, either mad or angry, and full of fear of death. Suddenly, he raised his left hand and sort of either pointed up somewhere or shook his finger at us all. The next moment, his soul, after one last effort, broke away from his body. As a last-ditch effort, an assistant rushed to perform CPR but was stopped. Joseph Stalin's death was confirmed at 9:50 p.m. on March 5, 1953. The autopsy report, now publicly available, identified the following as the cause of death. Arising on March 5th in connection with the basic illness, hypertension and the disruption of circulation in the brain, a stomach hemorrhage facilitated the recurrent collapse, which ended in death. The Pravda published the examination's results on March 7th, after which Stalin's brain, like Lenin's, was removed and taken to the Moscow Brain Research Institute, but it disappeared mysteriously, and it is unknown what happened to it since then. In 2001, Jonathan Brent and Vladimir Naumov co-published the book Stalin's Last Crime on the doctor's plot, and wrote that in the final version of the report submitted to the Central Committee, all mention of the stomach hemorrhage was deleted or vastly subordinated to other information throughout the final report. And this might not have been a coincidence. According to Svetlana, Beria was the first to run out into the corridor, and in the silence of the hall, where everyone was standing quietly, came his loud voice ringing with open triumph. "Krustalev, the car!" Historians believe this is a particularly interesting detail because out of the hundreds of employees present, he chose the guard who gave the order to the others protecting Stalin to leave. Additionally, Beria engaged in several suspicious activities surrounding Stalin's death. For example, he removed classified documents from the Kremlin. Some sources also suggest that he may have tampered with the dictator's desk in Kuntsevo. Moreover, after the fateful day, they tried to get rid of the guards. Lozgachev stated that he, Starostin, Orlov, and Tukov were all sent away from Moscow with immediate departure, along with their families. The latter 3 decided to see Beria and ask him not to send them away, to which Beria replied, "If you don't want to be out there, you'll be down there," while pointing to the ground, implying that if they continue to argue, they will be buried in a short time. Lozgachev eventually remained as a superintendent in the emptied Kuntsevo, which was ironically taken over by the Ministry of Health later. Orlov and Starostin continued to work at the facility and received positions in Vladimir, 123 miles east of Moscow. However, the fate of one of the key figures is highly suspicious. As I mentioned, Tukov claimed that Krustalov was the one who told the other guards to go to sleep on the night in question, relaying an alleged higher order, Well, he mysteriously fell ill and died shortly after Stalin's death. On March 1st, Krustalov left the dacha at 10 a.m., at the end of his shift, when the general secretary could have been lying unconscious in his study for hours by then. He reportedly told Lozgachev, Tukov, and Starostin, "Well, guys, here is an order we've never been given before. The boss said, 'Go to bed, all of you. I don't need anything. I am going to bed myself. I shouldn't need you today.'" Considering the strange order, the fact that it took at least 10 hours to bring the doctors, and Beria's extremely suspicious attitude, a theory began to take shape decades later. It all began with the doctors' plot, which not only affected doctors but also Nikolai Vlasic, one of the dictator's oldest bodyguards and head of security. According to the theory, once Stalin began the purge that spared neither his physician nor his head of security, Beria, one of his oldest henchmen, might become worried that the dictator would target his innermost political circle, a concern also supported by Stalin's restructuring of the political committee. This is why Beria, who was already acting as the first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers at the time, could entrust Krustalov, whom he had previously appointed to Stalin's security team, to send the guards to sleep so that no one would notice if something sinister happening inside the small dining room. Molotov's recollections also backed the conspiracy. The former People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs claimed that following Stalin's death, Beria told the inner circle, "I did him in," then boasted to Molotov and said, "I saved all of you." It is speculated that Beria could have been the mastermind of the plan, with Khrushchev's complicity. According to Brent and Naumov, a substance called warfarin could have been slipped into Stalin's diluted Georgian wine. It is a tasteless and transparent crystalline substance that was patented in the 1950s and became available in the Soviet Union as a blood thinner for cardiovascular disease, but was later widely used as rat poison. Hypertensive hemorrhage can lead to strokes, as Stalin sustained, but it doesn't have to be accompanied by gastrointestinal or renal hemorrhaging. At the same time, in addition to strokes, warfarin can also cause bleeding disorders in multiple organs. The autopsy revealed that the examination disclosed a large hemorrhage in the sphere of the subcortical nodes of the left hemisphere of the brain. This hemorrhage destroyed important areas of the brain and caused irreversible disorders of respiration and blood circulation. The left ventricle of the heart was significantly enlarged, and hemorrhages were found in the cardiac muscle, as well as in the lining of the stomach and intestine. These were all caused by high blood pressure, but at the same time, Miguel A. Faria, neurosurgeon and professor of medical history, explains in his research that even though the experts preparing the report must have remembered the tragic days of the doctor's plot vividly, they still successfully left traces for posterity. They fulfilled their professional duties as best they could, without compromising their careers or their lives with the new masters at the Kremlin, he wrote. We can infer that while high blood pressure can lead to hypertensive cerebral hemorrhage and stroke, it typically does not result in blood vomiting or hemorrhages in the cardiac muscle, like in the dictator's case. So it seems to support the poisoning that Stalin's collapse was caused by a stomach hemorrhage, perhaps due to the poison taken with the wine. It's also worth highlighting that in the autopsy report sent to the Central Committee, all mention of the stomach hemorrhage was deleted or vastly subordinated to other information throughout in the final report. After his death, Joseph Stalin was embalmed like Lenin, and the mourning crowd could visit the deceased dictator's displayed body for 3 days, before he was laid to rest in the Lenin Mausoleum on March 9th. The funeral was organized by Khrushchev, who had been elected first secretary by that time. Approximately 1.5 million people came from all over the country. The ceremony caused serious chaos sometimes, and many of them died in the scramble. The propaganda certainly achieved its goal, because despite his terrible deeds, many people looked back on the Georgian General Secretary with nostalgia decades later. They saw him as the man who industrialized the state from a backward czarist agrarian country and eliminated inequalities. When the coffin was brought to the mausoleum, it was carried by the most important politicians, with Malenkov and Beria at the front, sending a clear message to the world. Almost immediately after Stalin's death, the remaining leadership began consulting in the Kremlin and dividing power among themselves. They also invited the editor-in-chief of Pravda to the meeting, who later recalled that none of them dared to sit in Stalin's chair. They introduced the so-called collective leadership and delegated tasks so that no one could grow too powerful. Aside from the already mentioned First Secretary Khrushchev, they appointed Malenkov as the chairman of the Council of Ministers, Bulganin as Minister of Defense once again, and Beria as deputy to Malenkov and Minister of Internal Affairs. The order of power in the first months of the Stalinless Soviet Union looked like this. Beria was first, then Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin. However, the former head of the NKVD underestimated his opponents. In late June 1953, he was summoned to the Kremlin for a political committee meeting, but shortly after his arrival, they stripped him of his duties and arrested him. Beria was accused of treason and being a British spy. He was executed on December 23, 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev gradually assumed control. The so-called de-Stalinization, the eradication of the dead dictator's cruelties, personality cult, and controversial decisions began promptly after his death. The surviving doctors were released, as two of them unfortunately died in prison. The Gulag system was abolished in 1960, although political prisoners and other convicts were still sent to forced labor. On February 25, 1956, during the 20th Party Congress, the first since Stalin's death, Khrushchev delivered his famous secret speech behind closed doors, condemning his predecessor's policies and discussing his crimes. He stressed how Stalin ignored Lenin's collective leadership principles and managed everything alone. He asked whether it was normal that 13 years passed between the 18th and 19th Party Congresses, or that the Central Committee did not meet once throughout the Second World War. In 1961, Khrushchev even ordered to move Stalin's body from the mausoleum to the Kremlin Wall necropolis. The question remains as to why, if Stalin was poisoned, his surrogate family turned against him. Lavrenti Beria is undoubtedly the central figure of the entire scenario, but Khrushchev could also smell trouble, because in the period preceding that February night, the press repeatedly criticized him for his agricultural policies, indicating that something was off. Malenkov might also have been on the verge of removal, as a CIA intelligence report released after Stalin's death stated that it was only a matter of days before the dictator stripped him of all his powers and displaced him from the leadership. But Beria was different. First, there was an ongoing purge at the secret police, and in 1952, he was only allowed to enter the party congress in 6th place, while previously he was 4th. However, by January 1953, he had managed to rectify the situation to some extent. Everyone except Stalin feared him, but no one, including Stalin, trusted him, especially in his final years. It can even be stated that they hated him. Aside from his cruelty and the fact that he had files on everyone, there was a very compelling reason for this. Beria was one of the sickest sexual predators history has ever seen. His trial in 1953 brought some of his crimes to light, but the upper circles had long been aware of what he was doing with young Russian women and girls. Although the exact beginning of his savagery remains unknown, he not only participated in mass murders, but also had serial killer tendencies. Beria, who was also Georgian and raised in a deeply religious family, was 54 years old when he was arrested. He was unquestionably the second most influential man in the country behind Stalin, owing to his years as head of the NKVD and his profound understanding of political games and intrigue. People said that even in his free time, he was always machinating something, and as soon as the dictator died, he quickly attempted to seize control by turning the 3 other heavyweight politicians against each other. He was dissatisfied with Khrushchev's appointment as first secretary, did not consider Malenkov strong enough, and although Bulganin was in the upper circle, he was seen as the last among the firsts. He wisely attempted to build a base for himself, independent of the Soviet triumvirate, and as Minister of Internal Affairs, he implemented a series of reforms to boost his popularity. For instance, he brought back Molotov's wife, Polina Zemchuzhina, to Moscow after she was sentenced to internal exile in 1948. Furthermore, he freed 1 million prisoners, dropped another 500,000 cases, banned torture, and rehabilitated many previously important people. His actions were very suspicious, and the other leaders perceived the softening as a threat not just to their position, but also to the future of the party and the Soviet Union. Therefore, the hardliner trio decided to sideline him. On June 26, 1953, they summoned him to a mock Politburo meeting, although Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin had already formulated the master plan, which also included the military. Under the pretext of an exercise, Bulganin, the Minister of Defense, ordered soldiers alongside Kremlin guards, who were Beria's men, while Bulganin personally took Marshal Zhukov and several other generals to the complex, all of whom kept their weapons despite the ban. They waited in front of Stalin's former office and agreed with Khrushchev that 2 ringing would be the signal to burst in. Beria arrived late, his clothes untidy and without a tie, and Khrushchev informed him that he would be the only item on the meeting's agenda that day. Beria also brought a thick briefcase that Khrushchev assumed contained a gun. In 1988, Khrushchev's former speechwriter, Fyodor Berlatsky, recalled his boss's account later as the following: Malenkov was white as a wall and simply could not speak. Then I just jumped out and announced in a loud voice, "The agenda consists of only one question, about the anti-party factional activity of an imperialist agent, Beria. There is a proposal to oust him from the Presidium, from the Central Committee, to expel him from the party and bring him to trial. Who is for the proposal?" The Presidium of the Supreme Soviet was created in 1938 as a replacement for the Central Executive Committee and was the standing body of the highest body of state authority. It was a governing unit strongly influenced by the political committee, as except for a few, all Politburo members were also in the Presidium. Following Khrushchev's statement, serious arguments ensued, seasoned with various insults. Beria turned green all over and started mumbling something, said Khrushchev. But at one point, his former ally, the slightly panicked Malenkov, pushed the button, prompting Zhukov and his soldiers to push in and press a gun to Beria's head. Since his men guarded the Kremlin, they had to keep him captive until evening before slipping him out in a car trunk. First, they took him to the terrifying Lefortovo prison, but due to rumors of paratroopers trying to free Beria, they had to transfer him to General Moskalenko's headquarters, an underground bunker of the Moscow Air Defense District. Soldiers occupied Beria's offices, removed his photos, and the army entered the capital to maintain order. He attempted to persuade Malenkov and the others to release him via letters from his prison cell, but the guards refused to provide him with more paper and pencils after a while. Khrushchev appointed a new prosecutor for the 6-day trial, but Beria couldn't get a lawyer, couldn't appeal, and the chief judge was a marshal with no legal training. According to Izvestia's report, he had been on a hunger strike for 11 days before the trial began, and they could barely keep him alive until then. Authorities prepared a 100-page indictment against him, which he tried to ignore as he covered his ears most of the time. They convicted him of treason and for allegedly seeking peace talks with the Nazis in 1941. He was also found guilty of terrorism because of the 1941 purge carried out in the Red Army, as well as his counter-revolutionary activity in the Russian Civil War. The trial had exposed his sexual crimes as well, an unimaginable series of atrocities toward innocent young Russian girls and women. 2 of his bodyguards, Colonel Sarkisov and Colonel Nadaraya, testified that during World War II, while the people were under Nazi attack, Beria was regularly driven around Moscow in his black armored limousine on warmer days to kidnap young women and girls. As they drove, he just chose someone he liked and ordered his men to take these women to his dacha. He waited for his victims with a feast and wine, and then he took them either to his soundproof office or to the basement, where he raped them. Beria instructed Sarkisov to maintain a record of the abducted women's names and phone numbers, which he was later supposed to destroy. Instead, he secretly kept a copy and handed it over to the authorities. Hundreds of innocent women had to endure his cruelty, as he threatened them with prison if they resisted. And if they obeyed, he promised to release their imprisoned relatives. In one case, however, Beria picked up actress Tatiana Okunevskaya under the pretense of bringing her to perform for the Politburo. Instead, he took her to his dacha and offered to release her father and grandmother from prison if she submitted. He then raped her, telling her, "Scream or not, it doesn't matter," while he was aware that Okunevskaya's family members had been executed months earlier. Later, she was also arrested and sent to the Gulag. According to Antonov Ovseyenko, there were times when 6 or 7 young girls were taken to him in one night, and Beria forced them to dance naked for him. Meanwhile, he strolled among the defenseless women in his robe, inspecting them. Then he suddenly pounced on one of them. He called this the flower game. The day after their kidnapping, Beria released them and directed his guards to give each of the raped women a bouquet of flowers. If they accepted, it meant they consented to what he did to them. Reports from American embassy employees confirmed the colonel's confessions, as their accommodation was on the same street as Beria's house. According to historian Amy Knight, the soldiers frequently brought women to him in the late hours. Montefiore wrote in his book, The Court of the Red Tsar, that high-ranking Bolsheviks, including Stalin, became increasingly distrustful of Beria. Once, for example, the dictator himself freaked out when he found out that his teenage daughter, Svetlana, was left alone with Beria in his dacha. He immediately telephoned and told her to leave. He also praised the beauty of Alexander Poskrebishev's little daughter, Natalia, before her father pulled her away from him and forbade her to accept a ride from Beria at any time. He also showed interest in Voroshilov's daughter-in-law at a reception in their summer dacha, after which Beria shadowed their car closely all the way back to the Kremlin, terrifying his wife. These actions demonstrated that he had no fear of anyone. He targeted everyone, regardless of age or relationship status. However, the horrors are not yet over. In 1993, construction workers discovered human bones at Beria's former residence, which became the Tunisian embassy after 1958. And in 1998, the remains of 5 young women were found in the same garden. Furthermore, an Indian man who had worked there for 17 years discovered a plastic bag in the basement, which was also full of human bones. All these findings point to the fact that several people were even killed after being abducted. Vladimir Zharov, head of the Department of Forensic Medicine at Moscow State University and later chief of the Criminal Forensics Bureau, said that there was a torture chamber in the basement of Beria's villa and that there was probably an underground passage to burial sites. This was Beria's secret life, but he was also the one who ordered the Katyn massacre, during which 22,000 Polish officers were executed in March 1940. When he was head of the NKVD, the phrase "he went for a coffee with Beria" became widespread, referring to someone being arrested. He was considered extremely intelligent, and as previously stated, everyone feared him. It's important to note that both his wife and son denied that he was a sexual predator, blaming the accusations on the staged trial. However, Sarkisov also claimed that Beria's sexual appetite was out of control. During World War II, he contracted syphilis, which he had to treat in secret, and the former Minister of Internal Affairs admitted this during his interrogation. The Beria dossier was reopened in Russia in 2003, led by senior military prosecutor Valery Kondratov, and thousands of pages were compiled on him, including the list of hundreds of women and teenage girls raped by the former NKVD chief, but the names of victims will not be released until at least 2028. When he was sentenced to death, he fell on his knees and begged for mercy, which he did not grant to anyone, and it wasn't given to him either. Following the trial, he and 6 of his confidants faced immediate execution. General Pavel Batitsky simply shot Beria in the forehead, albeit there are 2 versions. One says that the execution took place while Beria was begging, and the other says that he was tied up in his cell, and that's how he received the bullet. After his death, he was taken to the crematorium, and his relatives were deported to Siberia. One theory suggests that he could have killed Stalin, who allegedly described him to Churchill as their Himmler, referring to the leader of the Nazi SS. Yet, medical historians argue that the question of whether he actually poisoned Stalin is not as simple as it appears. In addition to his childhood accidents and illnesses, the dictator had many other health issues throughout his life. For example, He contracted typhus in 1909 and pulmonary tuberculosis in 1917. In 1921, during the Russian Civil War, he had to undergo an emergency appendectomy that almost cost him his life because of the severe complications. In the following years, he suffered from chronic headaches and digestive problems, which caused recurrent abdominal pain with diarrhea and flatulence. Hypertension started in the 1930s, as did recurring joint and muscle pains, coronary artery spasms, and occasional angina. I mentioned that after World War II, his condition began to deteriorate even more drastically. In addition to nausea and high blood pressure, his memory began to worsen. He had difficulty speaking, and, according to those around him, he became more aggressive. Historians believe he suffered minor strokes in 1945 and 1947, as well as a heart attack in 1948. By the end of the decade, his face had changed too. Guests and visitors described him as much paler and with ruddy cheeks. He looked like a tired old man whose famous mustache was thinning. Regarding the autopsy report, the doctors, probably with the ongoing doctor's plot in their thoughts, may have intentionally removed all references to stomach bleeding so that they wouldn't be accused of actually poisoning Stalin. Worth noting that Beria had a history with poisons. On December 26, 1936, he summoned Abkhaz communist leader Nestor Lakoba to Tbilisi for consultations. The next day, he invited him to dinner and served him fried trout, his favorite dish, but he was also given a glass of poisoned wine. After dinner, they went to the opera, where Lakoba fell ill and died the next day. Official reports claimed he had suffered a heart attack, but a second examination found he had arteriosclerosis, a thickening of the arteries, cardiosclerosis, a thickening of the heart, and skin inflammation in his left ear. Medical historian and surgeon Matthew D. Turner opposes Stalin's poisoning. He wrote that, by the end of his life, his paranoia had evolved to the point that he regularly insisted on having his food lab tested on a retinue of labs and mice that went everywhere with him. The expert added that it is difficult to imagine that Stalin would have given an opportunity to the 4 people present, in whom his trust had waned, to put poison in his wine in some way. Furthermore, in 1951, scientists discovered that vitamin K could counteract the effects of warfarin overdose, making warfarin an unsuitable choice for assassinations. Moreover, warfarin overdoses can be associated with acute gastrointestinal bleeding, in addition to vomiting blood. It is extraordinarily unlikely that Stalin would not have displayed other symptoms of acute coagulopathy. Turner also pointed out that warfarin has a delayed impact on coagulation and only affects blood clotting over time. This usually means 24 to 48 hours. Thus, the poison should have been poured into his drink around the start of the Kuntsevo meeting. Of course, this is just another part of the theory, because it is not certain that they used warfarin, if they used anything at all. It's possible that his sedentary, chain-smoking lifestyle, multiple illnesses and accidents, stress, old age, and the alleged strokes and heart attacks all contributed to his death. But these explanations do not account for the fact that his brain vanished, the guards were sent to sleep, and the leader was left completely alone and unprotected from intruders for hours. And that's why his death is so mysterious. Joseph Jugashvili, Soso, Koba, Stalin, whose last nickname was Father of Nations, the priest-turned-meteorologist, bank robber, gangster, terrorist, Bolshevik revolutionary, anti-state rebel, convicted and exiled criminal, murderer, and mass-murdering dictator, died at the age of 74, just as he wanted to avoid. Weak, helpless, paralyzed, soaked in his own urine and humiliated. While above him, the people he thought were his confidants fighting for his seat. They don't help him and don't do everything for him, whom he was perhaps rightly afraid of because it is possible that they tried to take his life. This may bring some peace to the grieving families and to the 20 million people for whose deaths he can ultimately be held responsible, because in the end, Joseph Stalin was caught by the wolf pack.